The story begins in an ordinary apartment located in a colossal high-rise building. A 35-year-old man named Komaba Ritoku is having dinner alone. In front of him is a generous piece of meat with a side dish. Komaba cut off a piece and tasted it. He exclaimed with pleasure that it was extremely delicious. He had always thought that solitude was to his liking. The luxurious life of a bachelor seemed to him a real paradise. The young man looked out the window and thought, why constantly argue with someone and make concessions? When you are alone, you spend money at your own discretion. You live easily, you breathe freely. Komaba imagined other guys arguing with their girlfriends, while he was peacefully sprawled out on the couch, undisturbed. He was filled with pleasure. That was why, according to the guy, he categorically did not want to get married. Kumba dropped the fork from his hands and clutched his heart. He fell to the floor and would never get up again. This merry fellow had passed away into eternity. His life was cut short. Kumba had lived a life alone, and he had also died alone. His freedom knew no bounds, so how could he regret anything? Two strangers appeared before him. One in snow-white clothes, the other in black, like the night. Kumba thought for a moment and did not hide his surprise, because he had met those who called themselves gods. One of them admitted that he had caught the attention of a certain god of loneliness. The one in white put his hand on his friend's shoulder and said, "The thing is, this god really likes him, and now he is calling him into his mysterious world." The young man, stunned, asked, "Is he being offered to be born again, but in a different body?" He could not find the words to answer such a question, so he turned away and remained silent. Listening silently to these strange men, he tried to understand the meaning of their words. A thought flashed through his mind. In essence, he was being offered a new life in another world. Moreover, he was allowed to choose any abilities. He concentrated on selecting only the best skills that would allow him to live alone. The god of solitude, nodding in approval, approved the boy's choice. The man in white remarked that 5 qualities were enough to achieve the goal: good health, the ability to control any element, fencing, martial arts, and the ability to cast spells like a true master. As he said this, he counted everything on his fingers to make sure he had not made a mistake with the number of skills. He turned to Komaba in surprise, not understanding why he was so easily convinced of ordinary, unremarkable abilities. After all, there are so many fascinating and powerful skills. Meanwhile, Komaba wondered what life would be like if he were born in a completely different world. He casually replied that these things did not interest him. In the new world, the boy dreamed only of a quiet, lonely life as a bachelor. He was firmly convinced he was not going to change his beliefs. Hearing this, the god of solitude smiled broadly and benevolently. He found himself in a huge bedroom. In the crib lay a very small child. It was Komaba. The boy was trying to get up or reach for something. It seemed to him that he had really been born a second time. So, he then logically came to the conclusion, those who are now standing in front of him are his parents. A man and a woman were talking in front of him, their faces beaming with smiles. The beautiful woman held him tightly in her arms, and a man in glasses stood next to him. He looked at this company in surprise. The girl pinched his cheeks with all her might and laughed merrily at his confusion. Komaba was surprised to realize that he was already 35, and he was being treated like a little boy. This had to stop immediately. Meanwhile, the girl happily told her husband that the baby was incredibly happy. As I stood up, I thought with irritation that this was not true at all. He should have prayed to God that childhood would pass him by. The man picked up the little one in his arms. He and the girl met eyes, smiling faintly, and looked gently at the child. The man began to gently lull him to sleep. Komaba looked at the happy couple and thought that if this continued, he would simply burn out from the stress. The man, sighing in surprise, told the girl that it looked like the baby needed a diaper change. Komaba was momentarily confused, not knowing how to react. He glanced at the man, not understanding what he was going to do next. In his past life, he had, after all, already turned 35. He screamed at the top of his voice as soon as he was touched. Kumba only pleaded in his mind, "No, enough, stop." It was easier for him to die than to let anyone wash or wipe him. The man smiled and said that they would remove it now. Komaba thought in a panic, "Not that." The girl added that it was time to breastfeed. Crazy thoughts swirled in Kamaba's head. He would never agree to such a thing. Smiling, She announced that they would lift him up now. Kumba shouted in response that no one should touch him. In his imagination, the baby already perceived everything that was happening as a real hell in which he would have to fight for survival. 8 years pass. In the same house, in a spacious room, crammed with books and strange devices, is Sadaboy. His father was passing by the door of the room and decided to look in on his son. A man entered the room and addressed him. Zilk! The boy believed that Silka Lurin was his name, acquired in his new life. The man who approached him, Les Lurin, was his father. Silka shared with his father his plans. He was working on the drawings of a new magical device. The boy was convinced that he had been reborn in a world full of magic and monsters, a true fantasy kingdom. In this world, there are those who conquer the elements, such as fire. Others are skilled with a sword and fearlessly deal with various monsters. In this world, there are magical tools that resemble our household appliances to some extent. However, in terms of their capabilities, they are still far from modern technology. When God told him about this world, the idea of creating devices similar to household appliances to make everyday life easier immediately arose in his imagination. So one of the skills he ordered for himself was the craft of a magician. The Luron family is researching magical artifacts. Apparently, the god of solitude dropped this item here for a reason. The man, smiling amiably, asked the boy what he had come up with. Zielka showed the drawing and explained to his son that this magical device was called a refrigerator. Thanks to the low temperature inside, food could be stored in it for a very long time. Lester stared at it with admiration and amazement. The guy noticed that food spoils quickly in the summer, so they are usually dried or salted to preserve it longer. He reasoned that if it were possible to cook with fresh ingredients at any time of the year, it would be possible to diversify dishes and significantly expand their choice. The man, stunned by the picture he saw, shouted, calling out to Mira. Zilk, with a smug smile, reflected that food was his greatest pleasure. Above all, he sought to develop this direction. Zilka thought sadly about how much he missed fried chicken and highballs. His mother, Mira Lurin, entered the room. Looking at the drawing, she noted with a smile that it was her son's creation. Lest adjusted his glasses and noted that he was concerned about the possible strength and duration of the cold they would receive from the icy magic stone. Zilk was staring intently ahead. Zilk explained that cold air always sinks. If the frost is not too severe, there will be no difficulties. The parents looked at their son in surprise. Lester's glasses shattered from the incredible shock. Mira smiled and explained that that was why she had fixed the stone at the top. Zoc thoughtfully added that it would be nice to be able to freeze food, since the scheme itself still needed to be improved. Zilk began to complete the drawing. Les asked if it was possible to use 2 stones at once. Zilk confidently denied it, saying that one should remember about the depletion of the magic stone. Then the boy noticed that it was worth looking at the drawing more broadly. Les snatched up his son's drawing, exclaiming that he had a real genius in front of him. Tears glistened in Mira's eyes from excitement. She did not hide her admiration for his talent. Zilk, frightened by the unexpected scream, looked at his parents in confusion. Les, amazed, exclaimed that to create such an invention at such a young age was a true display of genius. Mira proudly added that this device was his own refrigerator, and confidently declared that it would definitely be a great sales success. The servants secretly watched them, discussing with amazement and admiration. The little master had created a new magical artifact all by himself, and he was only 8. His talent seemed simply incredible. It gave me goosebumps. One of the girls said that this was a really apt comment. She added that it was hard to believe that he was actually only 8 years old. You hugged the boy and shouted enthusiastically that he could change the world. Compared to this, the previous words about his bright future seemed almost a trifle. Zilk only had time to think that they would have been better off letting him go, because with such a hug, it was becoming increasingly difficult to breathe. Les gently stroked his head, while Mira held him tightly. Smiling happily, Les noted that with Zilko, the family no longer had any reason to worry about the future. The boy thought that sometimes it wasn't so annoying to be left alone in your room. Zilk reviewed his notes and realized that improving efficiency was no easy task. He reasoned that while he was still a child, he should constantly develop, absorb knowledge, and discover a lot of new things. Suddenly someone addressed him by name. A boy and a girl named Art and Ilya Laurent ran into the room. The girl, unable to contain her emotions, exclaimed loudly that they had come to play with her brother. Zilk pretended not to notice them at all. He was sure that everything was going according to his plan. A peaceful life was already looming very close. But suddenly Ilya pulled his vest and shouted, "Brother!" And Zilka suddenly screamed, threatening to tear his clothes off. Zilka explained to the girl that he was busy perfecting the magic instrument, but offered to play together. In response, Ilya screamed loudly, protesting. She did not want to play with him, but would only play with her brother. Ilya sighed sadly, admitting that he had always been like that. He had never joined in their games. He always sat on the sidelines and endlessly drew something in red ink. Zilk stood up and said, "Okay." Today, he would join their games. Ilya loudly exclaimed that he would choose catch-up. Artem calmly suggested that they hide and play hide-and-seek. Zilk gently stroked his brother's head, mentally admitting that nothing could be changed. However, he would definitely find time to finish the drawing. The eldest's duty was to take care of the younger ones, and that would never change. If you think about it, in his past life, he was constantly oppressed by the thought that this was why he couldn't do what he truly wanted. Zook sadly realized that the same thing was happening to him in this life. Meanwhile, Ilya happily exclaimed that they were playing checkers, and now he had to count to 10. Zilk called after them, ordering them to stop immediately. Running around the house was strictly forbidden. Meanwhile, the boy dreamed of mastering the art of creating magical artifacts as soon as possible, so that he could finally leave his parents' house and start an independent life. In the capital, Zilk studies at the academy. He is currently training. He is participating in an exhibition fight. He defeated his classmate without much effort. He can't figure out how Zilk pulled this off. He was about to attack with fire, because that was his element. But before he could even move, the teacher announced the end of the duel. The boy believed that Zilk possessed all the elements equally. But how did he manage to master more than 3? The teacher asked why he did not aspire to become a hunter or a knight. But Zilk replied that this had never attracted him. The boy was sitting at the table with his family. Zilka loudly declared that he never intended to get married. Lest remarked with admiration that there were so many different girls at the academy. Didn't he really like any of them? Lest replied awkwardly that he actually liked boys. Zilka sighed and said that it wasn't about that at all. He just wasn't interested in marriage, that was all. Zook came to the conclusion that he didn't need marriage at all. He had come to this conclusion in his past life. There was no room left in his heart for others. It's much more pleasant to enjoy solitude. No one is holding you back true freedom, and in the end, he won't change anything here. Les jokingly said that if he didn't get married, he would have to try on these things himself. Zilk interrupted him mid-sentence, declaring that he was not interested in this conversation. Not only the firstborn can inherit the land, he pointed out. After thanking him for the treat, Zilk turned and quickly left. Lest enthusiastically suggested that everything could change when Zil met someone special. Mira, somewhat embarrassed, confirmed her husband's words. It was true. Later everything could change, and Zil's opinion would change. Soon he would definitely come across a worthy bride. His name is Zilka Lauren. He is 28. He is not even thinking about getting married yet. Now he lives alone in the capital. He earned the title of Master of Magical Artifacts. Having settled in the capital, he opened his own workshop, where he earns a living by creating and selling unique magical objects of his own design. Zilka stopped his gaze on the shelf in the refrigerator. He thought it would be worth making the size even smaller. While the refrigerator is undoubtedly good that he managed to create it at all, it turned out to be noticeably larger than he wanted. Zilka was convinced that it was the refrigerator that brought the Lauren family an incredible fortune. But in those 20 years, he had invented many other useful things. Now his eyes fell on the toaster. Zilka happily announced that the toast was already toasted. He took a bite and remarked with delight that it was very tasty. This hot sandwich toaster is probably going to sell out. As always, he's created a truly amazing magical device. Zilk went outside and looked up at the sun. He exclaimed with delight that true freedom reigns here. Zilk believed that family matters, and all these endless attempts by Harridan to arrange his personal life had long since become tiresome. Finally, everything was behind him. Exhausted, almost with relief, he admitted that he had steadfastly withstood all the trials. A girl approached him. She said with a sweet smile that she could offer him a wonderful option. Zilka calmly refused. The man shouted that he had bought him a new magical artifact, and, as always, it worked flawlessly. Zilka only thanked him for such a high rating. The guy came to the conclusion that it was necessary to continue inventing something new. Zilk wondered, would it be possible to achieve even greater comfort? He smiled and said that his life would be perfect. After all, in the world of magical artifacts, he has no equal. He is a true master of their art. In this world, he will lead the refined and carefree life of a true bachelor. Sitting in a cafe, Zilka savored his favorite dish and wondered, could there be anything better than eating what you want, when you want? Indeed, grilled meat has a special, unparalleled taste when enjoyed alone. He walked leisurely down the street, watching the passers-by intently. Nearby, a man was shouting at the top of his voice, urging everyone to come up to him and buy something. He was treating everyone to delicious beef. While nearby, another man was loudly shouting that he was selling today's fresh elephant tuna. Zilk believed that he had been lonely in a past life and had left this world just as alone. Because of his lifestyle, the god of solitude advised him to start over in another world. Thus, he was born into the Lurin family, craftsmen who create magical artifacts. Everything was peaceful until he built his first refrigerator at the age of 8. Then his father gave him a very important mission. The fate of the entire Lurin family depended on him. As the years went by, people tried to get him married more and more, and there was a growing clamor. His mother indignantly asked when he would finally bring home a pretty girl. He imperturbably ignored all these insistent demands day after day. 28 years had passed since his rebirth, and he still hadn't found a bride. Despite this, Zilka walked down the street with a smile on his lips. He was convinced that he had already achieved the title of Master of Magical Artifacts, and he was carefreely enjoying his bachelor life in the capital. Zilk stopped in front of a huge building. He reminded himself that he had to work today. Zilko opened the door and entered the room. Inside, he was met by a young man who smiled kindly and greeted him. "Good morning?" Zilka nodded coldly and said, "Yes, good morning. This is Tristan. He works in the workshop." The young man looked at Zilkan carefully and asked why he was so gloomy today. Zilkan slowly took off his coat, hung it up, and replied that he did not consider himself sad. "I wonder what made you think that?" he asked. Tristan smiled broadly and noticed that such a stern face did not suit Zilka at all. A smile suited him much better. Let him smile more often, like he did now. Tristan added that after this, Zilk will definitely gain popularity. Zilka looked sternly at the employee and picked up his notes. He told Tristan that he did not want any fame. At the same time, Zilka sincerely thanked him for his concern. Tristan grumbled discontentedly that he was incredibly boring. The young man stretched his lips in a wide smile and declared that, if he were in your place, Tristan would hurry to enjoy life, tirelessly have fun and meet different girls. Zilk angrily remarked to himself how cheerful and infinitely energetic Tristan was. Zilk settled comfortably at his desk and leaned over his papers, putting on his glasses. He turned to Tristan to ask if the processing of the ice magic stones had been completed. The latter only smiled and assured him that everything was ready. Looking at Tristan, Zilk remembered that he was the one in charge of processing the magic stones here. The magic stone is the heart of every monster, but in its original form it is unusable. Its task is to perform a variety of functions. It gives the desired shape, smooths out irregularities, and makes the surface of the stone more convenient for further processing. Zilka adjusted his glasses and picked up a small stone from the ground. He turned to his worker, noting what a wonderful creation it was. Zilk pointed to the boxes filled to the brim with stones and ordered Tristan to recycle them all. Tristan sighed, saying wearily and sadly that he had too much work to do today. At that moment, a girl entered the room, her smile warm and bright. The girl's name was Raj, and she worked in the sales department. Holding up a few sheets of paper and smiling pleasantly, she wished both boys good morning. Then Raj headed over to Zilk's desk. Raj loudly slammed the newspaper on the table, making her presence clear. Leaning towards her boss, she loudly announced that she had brought an order for a new magical instrument. Zilk thought about Raj. She is adept at finding clients and arranging for the delivery of magical artifacts, always friendly and open in communication. In fact, she is responsible for all tasks that are not related to production. Tristan covered his ears with his hands and shouted loudly to the entire office about his new assignment. Reg smiled in response and asked cheerfully, "Isn't it bad to have a job?" Tristan replied in disbelief to the girl that yes, that's exactly how it is. But there are a catastrophic shortage of hands for such a large amount of work. The young man glanced at his boss, but Zilk pretended not to have heard a word. Reg crossed her arms over her chest and confidently assured her that she completely agreed. Come to think of it, there are only 2 employees. Reg and Tristan together were already looking closely at their boss. Raj approached him and waved her hand in front of his eyes. She smiled broadly and advised Zilka to listen carefully. Sales of refrigerators rose to unprecedented heights. Profits grew rapidly. However, the hero resolutely did not want to expand the team. Zilk replied indifferently that there was no need for that. Reg remarked wearily and sadly that if there were more workers, sales would increase. He added that there were still many people in the world who really needed our magic tools. Zilk addressed his employees again, reminding them, once again, that he was creating magical tools to make his own life easier and more enjoyable. He emphasized that he shouldn't even think about working for someone else. Reg stepped aside, placing her hand on her forehead, and exclaimed in despair that his attitude toward life had not changed at all. Tired but excited, Tristan shouted back that he still wanted to increase the number of employees. Zilka was silent for a few seconds, but finally asked why this was necessary. Ridge, standing next to her boss, looked at her colleague with a smile. Tristan, clutching his head, said nervously that if this continues... Tristan jumped up and, bursting into tears, shouted that he would never be able to find a girlfriend. Rogan Zilka stared at the boy, who was shouting loudly, showing no emotion. Tristan did not stop, exclaiming that Rouge was a real beauty. But unfortunately, she was already married. Then he turned his gaze to Zilka and loudly emphasized that there were no other girls here. Only a gloomy boss. In a job like this, you can't dream of a girl. The boy started crying even harder. Trisna, pressing his hand to his chest, said with pain that he was almost 19. He was passionately yearning for love, dreaming of getting married. Zilk watched this drama intently and attentively. The boss emphasized that work is not a suitable place for romantic relationships. Then he started listing all the reasons why marriage was not the best idea. Tristan burst into tears, and unable to hold back his screams, complained to Raj that Zilk was saying nasty things to him. The girl glanced at Tristan with a tired look. In general, he was not lying, but the meaning of what was said was quite distorted. Then Raj turned to Zilk with a question. Is marriage really that terrible? Raj remarked with a smile that there is nothing better than spending time with the person you love. Together, you share the happiness of parenthood, joyfully raising children side by side. Sielka introduced the hermit and explained to Rudy that although her position was quite popular in society, he himself preferred solitude. He did not like to communicate with others, and with children, Sielka added, he did not find a common language at all. The girl headed for the exit, throwing over her shoulder that they had already clarified this issue 100 times, so there was no point in arguing further. Zilk briefly confirmed that he completely agreed with her. Tristan, meanwhile, turned to his boss, saying that this was exactly why he would never get married. Zilk answered him with an angry, scorching look. The boy called out to Tristan not to draw the wrong conclusions. Zil picked up the magic stone and, addressing his workers, remarked that he had no use for the thing. He had no intention of getting married. Zilka added that he wasn't interested in it, so he shouldn't advise anyone. Besides, he didn't want to hear any complaints about someone not being able to find a girlfriend. Zilka gathered the papers and sternly ordered Tristan to get down to business. Ruga, with a weary sigh, emphasized that he was not only tall and well-educated, but also had a solid income and attractive appearance. But why does Zilk behave this way? It was already getting dark outside. Raj approached him with papers in his hands, asking if he could finish the work. Zilka took off his glasses and replied that that was enough for today. Tristan asked with a smile if they wanted to go somewhere for a bite to eat together. A new restaurant had just opened nearby, with interesting and appetizing meat dishes on the menu. The man excitedly announced that they served roast meat. However, you have to roast it yourself, cutting the meat into thin slices. Rouge thoughtfully noted that she was already familiar with this restaurant. The girl noticed that it was always full of people, and the place was called... Rouge and Tristan burst into joy. Magic roast meat! Silk raised his head and stared at the ceiling. He remembered that he had not tasted meat for a long time. So the boy turned to his workers and said that it would be appropriate to fry some meat. Reg cried out loudly and sadly, begging for forgiveness. She had to go home today because there was no one to look after the baby. So this time they would have to go to the restaurant without her. Tristan turned to Reg sadly, saying that it was such a beautiful day for a roast. Reg was about to leave, and although she wanted to join him, She explained that it was more important to spend time with the children right now. She slammed the door and shouted an apology over her shoulder for their difficult day. Tristan stared at the closed door with tear-filled eyes, while Zilk remained unmoved. Tristan finally got himself together and told the chief that he wasn't going there either. You can't solve anything with him together. Zilk, putting on his cloak, admitted that the boy was right and hastily straightened his clothes. Tristan called after him. Well, goodbye. Zielka said he would go alone then. The boy quietly walked past people enjoying time with family and friends. Loud conversations and genuine laughter rang out all around. As he passed the table where the young couple was sitting, Zilk inhaled the delicious aroma of their food. He was pleasantly surprised. Stopping, he was surprised to see a long line forming at the entrance to the restaurant. Zook remarked that yes, it was just time for dinner. The guy decided not to wait in line and immediately headed to the restaurant. The workers enthusiastically shouted that he was apologizing. In response, he called for the master to stand in line, and the cook shouted to his assistant to let him inside. The cook left the restaurant and approached Zilko. Clumsily, embarrassed, he asked for his forgiveness. The new employee had just started working and was still completely inexperienced. The cook shouted angrily, ordering the newcomer to apologize immediately. The boy stammered, apologizing to Zilko, but the man assured him that he shouldn't worry so much. Zilko glanced at the crowd and remarked to the chef that his establishment seemed to be doing well. The chef smiled encouragingly in return and admitted that it was all thanks to Zilko's support. He simply listened to his advice, and since then he has always been sincerely grateful to him for the support he provided from the bottom of his heart. The cook opened the door for the boy, and Zilk went inside. To the owner's praise, he replied that he was primarily trying to improve himself. Zilk only hoped that his place was still free. Zilk headed for the table by the window, and the cook happily escorted him to his seat, not hiding his sincere smile. Zilk sat down on a chair, carefully spreading out his napkin so as not to get dirty. The fire crackled faintly in the air. The cook turned to Zilk, asking what dish he wanted to order today. Zilk smiled smugly and assured the cook that he would do everything as usual. The cook, turning up the heat, exclaimed that he understood everything and would get down to business immediately. He placed the dish on the table with a drink, explaining that it was beef tongue cut into thick pieces. The chef then explained that he had also prepared thinly sliced diaphragm, steaks, and rib meat, all fresh beef, and offered a special drink called ale. Zilk skillfully took the tongs and carefully placed a piece of meat on the hot grill. He noted with a smile that this was where the juiciest red beef was served. The man watched with impatience as the meat gradually browned on the fire. When everything was ready, he took the dish off the grill and dipped it in the sauce. Zilk put a piece in his mouth, and a happy smile lit up his face. The dish turned out to be extremely tasty, and he was completely satisfied with his culinary creation. Zilka Tud is amazed. The aging technique itself, the skillful cutting, and the selection of spices. Everything at Maggio is much superior to what she has seen at other meat establishments. Zilk threw another piece of meat into the cauldron, and as soon as it was cooked, he greedily pounced on the dish, as if he hadn't eaten in a long time. The man drained a large mug of drink in one gulp. With a gurgle, he placed it on the table and made it clear that the taste was excellent. Zilka felt a pleasant pleasure from what he had done, something that would not have happened in the company of boys. Tristan would have stoked the fire with a beaming smile and insisted that he choose something to eat. Zilk usually replied that he liked rib meat. In response, Rouge happily exclaimed that she wanted a maniac's cock. Tristan, hearing the girl's words, immediately loudly declared that he shared her choice. Tristan grabbed his food so quickly, not even letting it cool. He exclaimed passionately that the dish was burning, and Rouge excitedly urged him to be more careful, to which Tristan waved it off. They said it wasn't his fault. It was all Mognac Mountain that was to blame. Zilka wondered how awkward he would be if Tristan and Raj decided to join them. In that case, he would hardly be able to fully enjoy the taste of the delicious meat. It was a good thing he had come here alone. Every table in the restaurant was already occupied by families or noisy groups of friends. The cook glanced at the waitresses, who were enthusiastically discussing something in raised tones, completely forgetting about their duties. One of the girls was embarrassed, sighing in shame. Mr. Zilk, as always, is unbeatable. Her friend exclaimed with satisfaction that today it was her turn to take orders from him. The exhausted girl exclaimed indignantly that this was completely unfair. The cook suddenly crept up behind them and, with a note of condemnation in his voice, said, If they bothered him too much, he would take their order. The girl replied loudly that everything was clear, as long as they left them alone. The cook, scratching the back of his head, glanced at the girls. Feeling embarrassed, he said that they were arguing among themselves anyway. Looking at Zilko's table, the cook remembered that Mr. Zilko Lurin was their regular visitor and generous benefactor. Until recently, his restaurant had been thriving. But now the chef was sadly aware that it was in real decline. Visitors were avoiding his establishment, and the doors had not been opened for guests for a long time. Meanwhile, new restaurants were opening in the capital, one after another, attracting a bustling crowd. The change continued, and he became more and more convinced that this fierce competition left his establishment no chance. The restaurant was barely making ends meet. There was almost no income. It seemed that the situation had reached a dead end. But one day, Zilk visited him, and the cook was happy to welcome the guest. Zilk was about to say something, but the man suddenly fell silent, and the cook asked what had happened. The embarrassed Zilk replied that he had had almost no visitors lately. Zilk asked the chef how the restaurant was staying afloat. The chef sighed in surprise, yet sadly admitted that his former restaurant had failed to adapt to new culinary trends. Zilk asked if he wanted something that would attract new customers to his meat. The cook replied surprisingly that that would be really good. Zilk thought for a moment and began to look around the room carefully. Suddenly, his gaze fell on a sign that announced, "The cook is distributing meat." Zilk exclaimed happily that he had a wonderful idea that would definitely work. The cook looked at the boy in surprise and listened attentively to his proposal. The cook, exclaiming in confusion, demanded that the meat be cut into thin slices, and the customer fry it himself. Zilka confirmed that this was exactly what he was proposing. The cook, with surprise and horror on his face, tried to understand what kind of absurdity this cunning fellow was promoting. The man calmed down a little, and admitted that it was nothing strange when the cook fried the meat. But it was the first time he had heard of a customer cooking his own meal. Zilk smiled and replied that frying it himself was much more interesting. The cook looked at him in surprise, hardly believing that Zilk was speaking in all seriousness. The customer will fry the thinly sliced meat himself, so there probably won't be any complaints. So the chef reasoned, deciding to take the risk. He had nothing to lose. In the end, this year turned out to be surprisingly successful. Visitors are delighted with the innovative way of preparing dishes right in the restaurant. Several friends visited his restaurant. One of them exclaimed loudly that everything was just wonderful here. Another, feeling a little embarrassed, remarked that if he overcooked the meat again, they might be left without dinner. Nearby, at the table, a cheerful group was chatting about a variety of dishes. One of the men jokingly remarked that the mere sight of the deliciousness made your mouth water, even if you just sat there and waited patiently. Meanwhile, the guests were eagerly devouring pieces of meat that they had just fried themselves, eating so fast that it was impossible to keep up with them. The girl noted that it was convenient to choose meat from different parts of the carcass. The man added that the spices perfectly accentuate the taste of the dish. There is even lemon seasoning available. Everyone was shouting at the waitresses, demanding more food. The workers ran up to him and excitedly reported that there were too many customers and they couldn't keep up. The cook, barely breathing, admitted that his head was already boiling with fatigue. The chef looked at his visitors and admitted, the daily queues and the lack of financial worries were all thanks to Mr. Zilka Loren. Two waitresses approached the guy. One of them asked the cook why Zilk was always sitting alone. After all, usually everyone had dinner together and fried meat, chatting and joking in the company. The cook replied to the girl that everyone finds joy in their own way. Mr. Zilk prefers solitude. It is better not to disturb him. The girls agreed with a little sadness that everything was fine. Meanwhile, Zilk finished his meat. He stared ahead thoughtfully, forgetting even about food. Finally, he said that the time had come to seriously start looking for rice. Zilk sat in his office, working enthusiastically on another sketch. He dipped his pen into the inkwell. Then, feeling tired, rubbed his forehead and took off his glasses. Closing his eyes, Zilk decided to rest for a moment. Zilka assured that today he would be able to figure out how to recreate the air conditioner. The boy looked thoughtfully out the window and quietly remarked that he hadn't walked around the city in a long time. Zilk visited the Adventurers Guild, a group of daredevils who make a living by killing monsters. All of its members are divided into teams. Their voices rang with loud laughter and lively conversation. Zilk, dressed in his gear, confidently approached the task board. He announced a new mission: gather the necessary materials, and hunt down a few small monsters. Zook tore off the task sheet and loudly declared that everything was fine. Since there were no scary monsters here, we could safely start gathering the necessary materials. He was patiently waiting his turn at the assistant's table, when suddenly a pretty girl loudly called out for the next one. Zilka confidently approached her with his request. The girl smiled broadly and asked how she could help this time. Zielka pointed to the ad and explained that he wanted to take this order for collecting materials. The girl took the form, looked at it carefully, and began to write the details of the order in the journal. With a joyful smile, she announced that the task would be to collect wolfgrass and mushrooms in the eastern forest. The girl, somewhat awkwardly, approached Zilka with an offer to join their group. Zilka watched the three of them, who were discussing something lively among themselves. The girl noticed that he had been able to reach such a level on his own. She was convinced that even greater achievements would await him in the team. Zielka smiled broadly and said that although he apologized, he would refuse. The guy immediately noticed that uniting with another group could turn out to be a serious disadvantage for him. Zilch reasoned further. If he joined a group with the blessings of the god of solitude, his physical strength would noticeably decrease. A few years ago, he had already attempted to complete the task together with others. His companion frantically shouted for Zilk to be careful, but it didn't help at all. The sorceress shouted in alarm that Zilk was injured. They needed to get out of here immediately. However, his companion desperately objected. It was simply impossible to get out now. The guy added that Zilk was a real weakling. He just stood there and did nothing. It seemed to Zilk himself that, supposedly, working together helps to become stronger. But this truth had nothing to do with him at all. Zilka was already leaving the reception desk when he suddenly shouted sharply to the girl that he was not going to increase his rank. Now he had permission to go on a mission. The girl followed him with her eyes, smiling enthusiastically, and muttered quietly, "How do you understand this?" Zilk headed into the forest, carefully searching for the necessary materials to complete the task. Looking closely at the ground, he noticed a mushroom and a tender green stem that he immediately recognized. He was lucky. It was kilk grass. It not only perfectly eliminates the smell of meat, fish, and food, but is also known for its antibacterial properties. Zilk was delighted with such luck. Zilk began to gather mushrooms and various herbs, carefully examining each ingredient he found. Soon his palms were already overflowing with all kinds of plants. Finally, having plucked the last mushroom, he exclaimed with joy that these specimens were simply unsurpassed. Sielke glanced at the ingredients he had gathered and said thoughtfully that this should be enough. Then he announced loudly that it was time to use his bag. With these words, Sielke placed the herbs and mushrooms inside the potion. Zilk decided that it was a magic bag. It could hold an endless variety of things and still not be full. Its capacity turned out to be much greater than it seemed at first glance. Zale continued to explain. These things are called artifacts. Their power exceeds the limits of human capabilities. For example, a teleportation wedding ring, a cloak that can lift into the air, or an invisibility cloak. The guy added that artifacts are truly rare treasures that are almost always found only in dungeons, so their value is extremely high. Many adventurers go there hoping to get rich. Zilk squatted down and began to lay down fresh grass that grew nearby. The man noted that, no matter how you look at it, the artifacts were extremely strange things. Zilk admitted that even he, as a skilled master of magical artifacts, was unable to understand the principle of their action. The guy was silent at first, and then suddenly exclaimed with delight that some mysterious romance was hidden in them. He smiled, mentally calling the artifacts mysterious technologies that people don't even know about. The boar was watching Zilko intently, but the boy paid no attention to him. He continued to collect grass with concentration. Zia confidently noted that the artifacts were capable of giving them a completely different level of convenience that magical tools could not provide. The boy exclaimed that his heart was pounding with excitement. He loved the feeling of comfort. At that moment, Silt noticed a rustling in the bushes. His gaze fell on the boar, who had already taken a concentrated fighting stance and was about to rush into the attack. Zilka smiled and handed him the mushroom, asking why he was angry that she had taken his favorite mushrooms. The young man drew his sword, and thoughtfully remarking that he had not given free rein to his muscles for a long time, prepared for battle. Zilk smiled in response and assumed a fighting stance, noting that he would not miss such a wonderful opportunity to practice. The boar rushed towards Zilka. The young man was about to strike, but the angry beast rushed past without even paying attention to him. Zilk looked at the boar in surprise. The boar prepared to attack, but the blow never came. The beast, as if trapped, was stuck between the branches and tried in vain to break free and rush at Zilk. Zilk awkwardly asked the boar how his fangs had ended up in the tree. The boar replied with disappointment that it was just a warm-up, but he was not going to let his opponent go. Zilka had dealt with the giant worm and gathered everything he needed from its remains. Sitting down on the soft grass, the boy carefully examined the trophy, wondering if it was time to finish collecting materials or perhaps head back to the same place. Having considered his next steps, Zilka moved forward along the forest path. His face lit up with a genuine smile as he saw the lake glistening in the sunlight and a flock of birds circling nearby. Zilk noticed that there was always such indescribable beauty in these parts. He happily announced that he was alone here. However, the boy froze and stared in surprise at the man who was dozing on a sun lounger nearby, with his tent towering next to him. Zil glanced at the boy with irritation, thinking that he was incredibly unlucky today. Carefully walking around him, he noticed that this place was not anyone's property. Anyone could be here. But the boy remained unmoved, not showing any reaction. Then Zilka moved even further away and thought with irritation that, apparently, he was the one who was superfluous to this boy here. Zilka unfolded the tent and smiling contentedly exclaimed that it was simply wonderful, something like this. Zilk spread out the eggs, meat, cheese, and nuts on the table. Taking out a small device, he exclaimed with joy that it was time to smoke. Zilk was proud of his ingenuity, for, in his opinion, he had created a real portable smokehouse. Zilk pulled out a knife and placed a piece of meat on the board. He noted that first everything needed to be cut and laid out nicely. Zilk carefully cut all the ingredients and arranged them on the plate. Zilka prepared the smokehouse. He lit it, turned it on, and put the lid on. Everything was in place. All that was left was to wait for the food to cook. He smiled and jokingly said that now he definitely wasn't afraid of hunger. Zilka sat down on a chair and took a book out of his pocket. Glancing at the smokehouse, he decided that everything would be ready very soon. He took off his glasses and added that it had been smoking for a long time. The taste should be incredible. The young man threw back the lid and inhaled the heady aroma of the freshly prepared dish. The boy looked at the food with joy. Suddenly someone exclaimed that the dish looked appetizing. Zilk shot an angry look at the uninvited guest. The young man looked at Zilk with joy in his eyes. Then Zilk asked who else he was. The boy exclaimed with delight that he was already 8. Zilk only thought wearily that he had come across another eccentric kid. Zilk angrily covered the plate with a lid, squinting menacingly at the neighboring tent. He exclaimed in irritation that he was the guy from the neighboring tent. 8, frightened, shouted that Zilk looked simply terrifying. The latter, still in his platoon, hurried to explain everything. It noticed that the aroma was incredibly appetizing, so he was intrigued. Zilk replied wearily that that was all. He had fully satisfied his curiosity and now wanted to return to his seat. But it didn't let him finish. It interrupted him, exclaiming that Zilk's dishes, although strange in appearance, tasted simply incredible. Zirk glared at the boy. He assured him that he wouldn't have brought it with him if he didn't like the taste. Then, shouting, he demanded to be given a piece to try. Zirk reached into his bag, took out several skewers, and thought that the boy had probably never tasted smoked meat. He held out one skewer. Zilk suggested that the boy take a skewer. Let him choose the one he liked the most. Yit smiled and stuck a small piece of cheese on the spear. He sniffed in disbelief. In surprise, it said he had never smelled anything like it. The scent resembled smoke, but at the same time, it was completely different. Eat put the cheese in his mouth and immediately exclaimed in unexpected delight, "The taste was incredible." Yisrajno asked loudly what kind of cheese it was, and what was special about it. Zilk smiled and replied that it was an ordinary cheese that he had bought at the market in the city center. Eve thoughtfully noted, "How can ordinary cheese be so delicious? Its taste and aroma are completely unique. It seems to be on a completely different level." It looked carefully at the plate and asked Zilka what kind of dish it was. Zilka explained that it was smoked meat with a wonderful aroma. It repeated uncertainly, "Smoked meat." Then he asked Zilka if the smoke really gave the dish a special, exquisite taste. Zilk took out a small bag and noted that only carefully selected spices should be used for a special flavor. I took the bag and asked what kind of chips were in it. Sawdust or something like that. Zilk confirmed that this was true. By the way, The bag contained apple sawdust. The man looked curiously at it, who tried to sniff the contents. Irritated, Zilk snatched his bag of sawdust from him. I looked at the other goods and asked Zilk what else he could offer. Zilk sighed and ordered him to bring a plate. He wouldn't let him in without it. I'd instantly rushed to his tent and returned with a plate, a glass, and a bottle of wine. Zilk looked at him in surprise. It smiled broadly and explained that it was a thank you for the delicious food and the kind welcome. Zilk, glancing at the bottle, exclaimed in surprise, "This is wine from Barros." The guy immediately remembered that it was a rare drink, made in the famous Barros wine region. Zilk added that only a few hundred bottles are supplied from there each year. With a broad smile of pride, it declared that he knew everything, and let the boy think that it was a jewel, not wine. Then, it suggested that the young man taste the drink. Zilk raised his glass, and kindly replied that he would be happy to join. Zilkanit returned to his tent and began to eat dinner. Zilk, taking a sip of the wine, exclaimed with delight that its taste was simply unsurpassed. He popped a piece of smoked meat into his mouth, closed his eyes, and purred contentedly. These smoked meats and wine were simply incredible. Zilk, looking at the wine in his glass, smiled and remarked that he had never expected to try such a drink. At the same time, he remembered how in a past life, single people often shared everything they had with each other. He was always happy when he got something equally delicious in return for a treat. Ethan exclaimed at the top of his voice that this was a real treat, extremely delicious. Zilk smiled and glanced at the lake. He wondered aloud what he would do fishing after a hearty lunch. As evening fell on the city, Zilk slowly walked towards his home, strolling through the streets. Zilka said it was time to go home. He was going to fry fish for dinner. Suddenly the guy stopped and noticed a caretaker standing in the parking lot near his house, which surprised him greatly. He wondered what exactly had appeared in front of his home. They said that someone from his family had been brought here. But no, there was no coat of arms visible on the carriage. It was a very ordinary carriage. The girl suddenly ran up to him from behind and shouted loudly that he had finally appeared. Zilk, stunned, shouted back, "It's Ilya!" The sister angrily exclaims that he has finally deigned to appear. Zilka was stunned to realize that this was an unpleasant surprise. After all, it was their family's carriage. Looking at his sister, the boy asked Ilya in surprise if she had come alone. Ilya answered her husband's call, jokingly remarking that she would never be let out alone. Jillian was with her. The man bowed politely to Zilka. The guy looked at him in confusion. Did Zilka really think that Jillian was just the butler and bodyguard of the Lauren family? The boy asked his sister why they had deliberately arrived in a carriage without a coat of arms. Elia glared at him angrily. She pointed out that if she had arrived in their carriage, he would have run away in an instant, barely noticing her. Zilka turned away, and vividly imagined himself running away from the carriage when it appeared. Zilk asked the girl for what purpose they had come to visit him. Ilya could not contain his emotions and exclaimed, "Why?" "We received an invitation to a family dinner." Apparently, he was also supposed to receive a letter. Zolk admitted hesitantly that yes, something like that really happened. He told his sister that he would stay. He still had a lot of work to do. It was not up to him. But Ilya, meeting his gaze, sharply objected. No, he would go with her, whether he wanted to or not. Zilk was about to leave, firmly declaring that he would not go. Ilya confidently grabbed his hand and firmly said that she would go. Zilk looked at her angrily and repeated once again that he was not going to go. The girl, glancing at him in irritation, insisted, "I will go." Ilya looked at his brother and reminded him that he had been refusing for a whole year. Mom was restless with anxiety, and Dad insisted that she simply had to take him with her. She promised she would do everything. So he had to appear before his family. Zilk looked at Ilya in surprise and thought that his father must have asked her to bring him home. With anxiety in his voice, Gilliam informed Zilka that the inhabitants of the estate were very worried about the fate of the young master. He sincerely asked Zilka to pay at least a little attention to the family. Zilka only grimaced sadly. He felt terrible at the thought that he was simply unable to refuse Gilliam. The boy sighed and grabbed his head. He agreed, but warned, "Just don't call me young master." Ilya exclaimed with satisfaction that this was his small victory. Gilliam smiled and thanked Zilka. The guy told them that he would go get ready now and then join them. Ilya asked why he didn't want to invite them to his house. Zilk irritably snapped that he didn't want to do that. The girl glared at him and angrily asked the reason for such a refusal. Zilk silently headed for his house. He shouted loudly to his sister that he never let strangers into his house. She angrily objected. "Strangers, you say?" At that moment, Ilya grabbed him by the jacket and exclaimed that she was actually his own sister. Zilk explained that it was his sister, but as soon as she was in his room once, she immediately broke all his magical tools. So now he categorically refused to let her in again. Ilya looked at his brother in confusion, not believing what she had heard. Ilya screamed at the top of her voice, remembering that it had happened 15 years ago. She begged to be let in. Zilk warned her that if she continued to scream, she would scare all the neighbors. Ilya, Zilka, and Gilliam crossed the threshold of the ancestral estate. Lest exclaimed happily that Zil would finally be able to join them. They hadn't seen each other for a year. How was he? The boy replied to his father that only a year had passed, and nothing had changed. Lest warmly patted his son on the back and went into the room with everyone. The man happily shared with Zilka that it was the absolute truth. He was really all his mother. Time had no power over him. He had not aged at all. Elijah told her father that they would talk at the table. Gilliam opened the door for them, silently confirming to his daughter the truth of what had happened. Mira was already waiting for them in the room. She looked reproachfully at Zilko and asked why he had returned so late. The young man looked at his mother and answered her question. He noted that he needed some time to prepare. He couldn't call so unexpectedly. Mira exhaled and angrily reminded him that the invitation to the family dinner had been sent in advance. Ilya, displeased, informed Mary that her brother had rejected all her persuasions and refused to go, so she had literally had to drag him here by the hand. The woman looked at her daughter in astonishment. Ilya exclaimed loudly, turning to Mira to finally listen to him. She had been traveling to him for a long time, tired from the journey, and Zilks was sitting next to her with a sad, distant look, impatiently waiting for the moment when he could leave. The man put his hand on his shoulder and joyfully exclaimed that he was a good man, because he had returned home. The hero decided that Ludwig was Ilya's husband. Zilka glanced at her husband in surprise and turning to Ludwig asked, "Why is he here too?" Ludwig, sitting down at the table with a smug smile, replied, "Well, it's a family dinner. Of course I'm here. What did you think?" Zilk thought that this man was the same alchemist he had once worked with, and now he turned out to be Ilias's husband. Frankly, he had no idea that things would turn out this way. Ludwig, whose eyes were filled with tears, suddenly asked to introduce him to this girl. Zilk remembered how Ludwig had sadly confessed to him last week that he didn't want to go to the family dinner. He had already mentioned this during their last meeting. Zilk looked at Ludwig and asked him to stop. In response, Ludwig only stubbornly said that he had no such desire. Without thinking twice, Ludwig kicked Zilk's leg with all his strength under the table, so that it would go unnoticed by the others. Zilka winced in pain. Ludwig glared at him and sharply asked what he was about to say. He said it was time to learn to feel the tension in the air. Zilka irritably asked Nick why he was trying so hard to appear polite to his mother. To which Ludwig Tansley replied with a smile, "Of course you should only show yourself from the best side." Ludwig smiled gently and called Sailor. He carefully asked if she was happy to see Uncle Zilka. The man, glancing at Ludwig, thought that he had deliberately misdirected the conversation. In turn, Zilka stopped his gaze on the girl. It seemed to him that she was the daughter of Sailor, Ludwig, and Ilya. The girl sat down at the table next to the adults and turned to Zilka with curiosity, saying, "Is he her uncle?" Lest laughed out loud and shouted to her son that he visited so rarely that Sela had already forgotten what her relative looked like. Ludwig, barely holding back his laughter, covered his mouth with his hands. Zilk angrily turned away and changed the direction of his gaze. Ilya affectionately hugged his daughter by the shoulders, bowing his head to her hair. The girl watched her uncle with curiosity. Ilya gloated. Lu advised Zilka to at least say hello to her lovely niece. He frowned even harder and angrily blurted out, "My name is Zilka Lurin." Sela turned to her uncle with curiosity, asking why he was still unmarried. Everyone in the room looked at the girl in surprise. Ilya, unable to hold back a smile, gave his daughter an approving thumbs up. She exclaimed happily that Sala had been clever and had asked exactly the right question. And Mira looked sadly at her son and sighed. Zilka is already 28. When will he finally get married? Zilk clenched his jaw, angrily thinking that it was all happening again. Turning away from his sister, he loudly declared that he was not going to get married. Ilya asked irritably why he didn't want to. Zilk confidently declared that he preferred a single life and was not at all concerned about marriage. He glared at Eli and asked irritably how many more times he had to repeat those words. Ilya hesitantly asked if he could stay with the boys. Zilk exploded in despair, growling that it was impossible. The young man sighed inwardly. He was tired of constantly bringing up this issue. Ilya pursed his lips, frowned, and asked sadly, "Where is his girlfriend?" Zilk gritted his teeth in rage and shouted loudly that he had no use for her. He was sure he had repeated this hundreds of times. Mira, with a strange surprise, asked her husband if her son had not yet liked any girls. Less thoughtfully, the husband replied that his girlfriends and acquaintances often asked him to introduce them to his son. Ilya replied that, of course, her brother can be called a real magnet for girls. In her opinion, Zilka has a higher education, is tall and attractive. In addition, he is unmarried, the eldest son in the family, and can boast of a high income. Mira suddenly burst into tears, casting a sad look at her son. Zilka, unable to bear it, turned away, wishing not to see the suffering in the eyes of his mother and sister. Miras quietly added that she sincerely hoped that one day a girl would appear in his life who could change his views. Miras broke the silence with a loud cry, demanding to meet her children. Ilya, unable to contain his irritation, threw it at her. If it weren't for his talent for inventing magical devices, she would have considered him a real fool a long time ago. Meanwhile, Zilk was strangely thinking about only one thing: how much he wanted to go home. The guy cleared his throat and asked where his brother Art was. Ilya looked at Zilka and calmly replied that Art was at a party right now, so he wouldn't be able to come. Zilka raised his voice in annoyance and protested. It's not that Art didn't want to come. He just wasn't allowed to. Their looks eloquently testified. He had asked the wrong question. Mira noted that he had disappeared longer than Art allowed, so he had lost the right not to appear. Ilya objected, saying that Zilka did not understand anything, and that only Art gave him true freedom. For him, this was incomprehensible and remained a mystery. Zilka looked at Mira and Ilya in surprise. The girl told him that it was because of him that Art had taken on the responsibilities of the eldest son and was able to enter the upper world. Zilka had already apologized to Art and deeply appreciated everything he had done. Less hesitantly, she added, "Okay, that's enough. It's time for them to eat." Sala exclaimed loudly that she was very hungry herself. The housewives began to set the table. The girls bustled around, holding plates and trays. Mira, full of curiosity, asked Zilko if he often ate at home like everyone else. He, putting down his napkin, calmly replied that he usually cooked for himself what he liked. Ilya smiled even wider and wondered if he had simply bought expensive meat and fried it. She joked that he had probably added expensive wine to it. Zilk just closed his eyes and calmly denied that it was anything but. Zilk stopped abruptly and looked ahead intently. His daily worries flashed through his mind, and he admitted, Ilya was absolutely right. After all, he really likes to roast meat on a fire, cook smoked meats, and always eats whatever he wants. Feeling confused, Zilk was forced to exclaim to Ilya that she had guessed correctly. Ilya exclaimed with delight that if he continued to eat like that, he would inevitably have health problems. Zilk crossed his arms over his chest and looked closely at his sister. He whispered that thanks to the blessing of the god of loneliness, nothing would happen to him. The illness would pass him by. Ilya, with anger in his voice, demanded that Zilko explain what he had just muttered to himself. With a sly smile, Zilks informed Ilya that he had never been sick in his entire life. The boy happily decided that this was due to the blessing of the god of solitude. With indignation in her voice, Mira shouted to her son that his father was right. Now he was mindlessly swallowing everything in a row, and later it would cost him dearly. Zilk, grimacing with discontent, thought only about one thing: how much he wanted to go home. Sala's stomach rumbled loudly, and, somewhat awkwardly, she asked what they would have for lunch today. Everyone looked anxiously at the baby, who was already suffering from hunger, and only then realized that they had completely forgotten about it. Sala puffed out her cheeks and glared at her mother. To calm her down, Giltali assured her granddaughter that he was apologizing. The adults were so engrossed in their conversation that they completely forgot about dinner. Ilya smiled shyly and apologized to her daughter as well. Zilk looked at the girl, imagining her as a savior angel. He thought happily that Sala was a real angel. She could be used. Lest raised his glass and, beginning his speech, wished his family prosperity in the future. The man shouted for everyone to drink to the bottom. The glasses clashed merrily, and even the cabin boy raised her glass of juice, joining in the general toast. Ludwig stared in amazement at the plate, where a piece of fish was displayed, generously sprinkled with juicy lemon. Clumsily, a little embarrassed, the boy admitted that he had never tasted such fish before. Ilya asked his brother in surprise if he had really caught this fish himself. Zilk proudly confirmed. Yes, it was a sabana. Meanwhile, the boy thought that today he really wanted to eat fish. Lest exclaimed with delight that it looked wonderful. Ludwig and Lest each cut off a piece and began to chew it carefully. Immediately both groaned in surprise. Lest, hesitantly, asked his son if it was really savannah. The son replied in surprise that he had tasted this fish before, but this time its taste was strikingly different from previous dishes made from the same fish. Ludwig cut off another piece of fish and noticed that its taste and aroma were strikingly different from the usual fried food. Selah, having tasted it, exclaimed happily that it was indeed extremely delicious. Ilya looked at her daughter in surprise and said, "Wow, you don't like fish." However, the girl loudly objected. They said that this fish doesn't stink at all. On the contrary, it pleases with its wonderful aroma. Gallum took out the smokehouse and smiled, explaining that he had cooked the fish with Mr. Zilks's magical device. Lest and Ludwig examined the strange artifact with curiosity. Ludwig admitted that he had never seen this magical device before. Zilk proudly explained, "In this magical device, special plates are first burned, and only then the fish is smoked." Ludwig took the smokehouse in his hands and began to examine it carefully. The man adjusted his glasses and enthusiastically told Zilka that he had once again impressed him with his invention. Ludwig approached Zilko and looked him in the eye. He asked Zilko to sell him one copy. Zilko stood there with a spoon near his mouth and stared at the boy in surprise, then almost exclaimed that he himself would not mind having such a magical instrument. Zilk saw the eagerness to possess this magical object flash in Ludwig and Lest's eyes. He was filled with angry determination. He would not give them the smokehouse, under any circumstances. Zilka thought for a moment and realized that refusing would only complicate the situation. The guy sighed reluctantly and agreed, "Okay, I'll make them one copy each." Ludwig and Le hugged, joyfully exclaiming, "Hooray!" Meanwhile, Zilka sighed inwardly. He wanted to be home already. Zilka sat at his desk, not knowing where to start. He grumbled angrily that he couldn't move forward because of yesterday's fatigue. Already on the threshold, he heard Mira calling out loudly after him to drop by more often. Everyone would be waiting impatiently for him. An exhausted Tristan came out to him, barely suppressing a yawn. He announced that he was going on a lunch break. Zilka looked at the boy in surprise and asked, "What, it's already lunchtime?" And then, without thinking for a moment, decided to join him. Zilk thought he would like to try one of the street snacks that the cook was currently preparing. However, the boy sat down at the table with difficulty, clenched his pen in his hand, and began to write something angrily. Unexpectedly, Zilk abruptly declared that there was no question of lunch. He had not made any progress today, so he had to work a little more. Zilka felt wearily as if the fish were dancing in his head, singing to his plans for the refrigerator. He concluded that such thoughts were swarming in the mind of a man who could not concentrate. Zilk wearily dipped his pen into the inkwell and said that it was better to relax a bit now. The boy went outside and headed to the merchant's to buy something to eat. The smiling chef asked Zilko what he wanted to buy this time. The guy glanced at the soup bubbling in the pot and said that he wanted to order tomato soup with seafood. Zilk studied the seafood delicacies hanging above the counter. His gaze fell on the powerful claws of a crab. He sighed dreamily, already anticipating a stunningly delicious meal. Zilk also ordered crab skewers from the chef. The seller, loudly exclaiming, announced the price, 900 sores, and persistently invited more people to come. Zilk walked over to the tables. He was lucky to find a free seat, so he happily settled down. Looking at his lunch of soup and crab meat, Zilk couldn't help but smile happily. Zilk loudly declared that the aroma of the dishes was simply enchanting. First of all, he would taste the crab in its shell. Zilk tore off a piece of crab meat and groaned in satisfaction. The taste was unbeatable. Zilk imagined a crab engulfed in flames. It seemed to him that the incomparable taste spread throughout his mouth. The crab was perfectly seasoned and grilled over charcoal. Zilk concluded. It was a true gastronomic miracle. In a matter of seconds, the boy had destroyed all the meat, leaving only the bone, which he carefully placed next to the bowl of soup. Zilk happily accepted the bowl of soup, enthusiastically remarking that the dish looked incredibly appetizing. The boy decided to start with the broth. Zilk raised the plate to his lips and greedily took a few sips of the clear soup. Zilk licked his lips, thinking with satisfaction. The bright taste of seafood, the light sourness of tomatoes, all of this impatiently simmered on low heat, and the hot pepper added a savory spiciness. Zilk grabbed a spoon and skillfully scooped up some of the ingredients. The boy impatiently said that it was time to check how thick the soup was. Zilk hastily pounced on the food, finishing whatever was left. Zilk placed the soup on the table, beaming with a broad smile, and exclaimed with delight, "Thank you for the treat." After lunch, Zilk decided to take a leisurely stroll down the city street. Around him, a sea of people was bustling. Everyone was hurrying about their business. Smiling, Zilk remarked that his lunch had been simply wonderful. Someone held out a sheet of paper, and the boy took it in his hands. Zilka exclaimed that he had taken the leaflet almost without realizing it. Meanwhile, the friendly girl, handing out information brochures, was already handing them to the next passerby. The guy sighed heavily. With a tired sigh, Zilka muttered that it was just some boring postcard and he would just throw it away. He was about to fold the sheet in half when his eyes suddenly caught sight of the image. Zielka was surprised to notice that the orchestra was going to give a concert soon. The postcard showed the orchestra itself in black and white, and the dates of the performances were listed just above. The musicians entered the spacious hall where the performance was soon to begin. The girl with the violin hurried ahead, remarking enthusiastically that every sound echoed very vividly here. She adjusted her shoes and held the violin in her other hand. She complained awkwardly that she had bought extremely uncomfortable shoes. They were about to give her blisters, so she would hardly be able to walk any further. The girl who was standing next to the weirdo with a dragon for a head. She turned to her. "Catherine!" And the woman exclaimed joyfully that everything was about to begin. Katarina cried out in alarm, urging them to hurry. The girl was rapidly approaching her dream among the orchestra musicians. The performance began just as the last of the guests crossed the threshold of the hall. Zilk looked at the orchestra in surprise. He was deeply impressed and couldn't believe his eyes. It was truly breathtaking. In his previous life, he had only heard classical music on CDs. Zilk persistently argued that real emotions in real life cannot be compared to those transmitted on television. The conductor, smiling at his musicians, waved his baton briskly, setting the tempo for the orchestra. Zilka studied the musicians closely and noticed that this world had its own unique instruments, although some of them resembled Earth ones. He was particularly interested in an unusual device that looked like a ball of intertwined pipes. Zilk wondered what kind of sound this strange instrument could make. It seemed impossible to play even a simple melody on it without magic. The guy reasoned that in this world, tools don't necessarily have to have the usual shape. What if his cooler had curves similar to this tool? Zilk looked at the device again carefully and thought with relief that he would cope with the task. Meanwhile, his friend, nervously, admitted that although he remembered what he had planned, he really wanted to go home. Evening came, and Zeke returned to his workshop to put his plans into action. Rudd, with a joyful exclamation, praised their joint work, but she had to get home, so she headed for the exit. Zeke also appreciated the efforts of the day, noting their success with satisfaction. Raj slammed the door and headed home. Zilka studied his sketch carefully, a satisfied smile on his face. It seemed to him that the idea for the new cooler had turned out surprisingly well. Tristan, beaming with a broad smile, called Zilk over and suggested they have dinner together somewhere cozy with delicious food. In response, Zil glared at him and said that it was a bit strange for him to see two guys going to a restaurant together. Tristan frowned, sweat beading on his forehead, and asked uncertainly what he had said to the chief. Zilk got up from the table, calmly picked up his coat, and began to pack for home. Without any expression in his voice, he told Tristan that he was leaving. Tristan abruptly blocked his path and shouted loudly, ordering Zilk to stop and stay. Tristan made a sad face and tried to convince Zilko to understand him. The young man looked pleadingly at the boss, his voice filled with desperate hope. Now he had no money left. Tristan added that he was asking Zilko to lend him some money. Zilk, frozen in surprise, stared at Tristan for a few seconds in silence, not knowing what to say. Finally recovering, he grabbed the boy by the shoulders. Zilk, with a stern expression on his face, looked Tristan in the eyes and asked, "Is he not paying him enough? Doesn't he think the opposite?" Tristan sheepishly admitted that he had spent all his money on a gift for his favorite cabaret girl, so he had nothing left for dinner. Zilk straightened his jacket in annoyance and said curtly that he was just going home. Tristan, with despair in his eyes, clung to Zilka's leg and cried out through his tears that he could not let him go. No, no, he must not leave him. Zilka tried to shake Tristan off, but he held on tightly. In agony, Tristan cried out that he longed for Zilka to cook him delicious meals. The young man looked with delight at the leg of Chief Gova. A sweet, almost innocent smile appeared on his face. Dropping to his knees, he looked up at Zilko, pretending to be defenseless. Tristan joked that the boy was begging Zilko for expensive delicacies, because he had never had to dine together in such company before. Zilka turned away from Tristan, mentally noting that a leader, after all, had a duty to take care of his subordinates. In response, Tristan exclaimed indignantly that he didn't have a penny left on him. Zilka sighed wearily, feeling irritated. Tristan and Zil were walking through the evening streets of a big city. Full of enthusiasm, Tristan turned to his boss, who was walking nearby, and shared his dream of going to Meggio to taste the delicious meat there. Zilch didn't even glance at Tristan. He just said curtly that he wouldn't do that. He had just been there himself. Tristan exclaimed in surprise. Who did Zilk go to Maggio with? Did he have a girlfriend or friends? Zilk calmly met his gaze and replied that he had gone there alone. Tristan Oak claimed to have dined alone at the restaurant. The man glanced at his boss. Tristan imagined people at Mejos grilling meat together, chatting happily, and spending time in friendly company. The guy jokingly pursed his lips and told the boss, if he can't go to Meggio, let him decide where to send him. Zilk smiled and replied that that was exactly what he planned to do. The boy glanced at the sign and froze. Zilka apologized to Tristan, explaining that he needed to stop by the artifact store for a moment. Tristan looked at him in horror, and Zilka could not understand such a reaction at all. Tristan said in distress that now everything was really serious. If he went in there, he would stay for a long time. Seeing Zilka heading towards the shop, Tristan cried out, begging him to stop. Zilka and Tristan crossed the threshold of Ardeas's shop. Mysterious artifacts and various rarities glittered around them, filling every corner of this unusual place. A man in a goat mask with teeth as sharp as blades came out to him. His body was wrapped in heavy knightly armor, bound with numerous chains. Tristan quickly hid behind Zilko. The guy confessed to the boss that the security guard at this store gave him goosebumps. He was in full gear. Zilk smiled, noticing the expression on Tristan's face. He informed his subordinate that this guard was simply crazy about artifacts. Zilk casually waved his hand at the guard in greeting. Tristan watched all this in amazement. In his mind, he noted with horror. Anyone who was fascinated by artifacts seemed to him a real madman. Tristan approached the counter with the selected items and asked in surprise why the artifacts were always so expensive. Zilk exclaimed with admiration that he would never get tired of visiting here. The seller calmly explained that the prices were always at this level. The shop owner, Guan, emphasized that the artifacts, regardless of their usefulness, remained unique and could not be copied, so the high price was fully justified. Zilk, shaking his head, made it clear that he agreed. Tristan, on the other hand, mentally noted that he did not share such logic at all. Guan explained that he had already visited 3 days ago and had cleared everything beforehand. Zook just nodded, saying that it was no big deal. He wouldn't skimp on valuable artifacts. He glanced curiously at the chest Guan had placed in front of him. Silk asked the owner if there was anything new. Guan looked at the boy and noticed that he had something he might like. Zilk responded by asking to demonstrate this artifact. The shopkeeper took out the object and handed it to Zilka. He examined the artifact carefully, taking in every detail. At first glance, Zilka noticed that it was an ordinary bowl. A narrow rim, no decorations or frills. Absolute simplicity. Surprised, Zilk hesitantly asked Guan, "What's the trick?" Guan only smiled at this and suggested that they closely monitor his actions. The salesman looked at the cup carefully and loudly shouted the command to fill it. The cup trembled and gradually began to fill with liquid. Zilk shouted in surprise, not believing his eyes. This could not be. This cup generated carbonated water. Guan confirmed with a smile. That's right. It was a foamy glass. Guan carefully poured the soda into a glass. Zilka remembered that there was only one mysterious source in this world where soda was mined. Because of this drink was a real rarity, available only to the rich. Zilk drank some soda from his glass and set it down on the table. Silk looked Guan carefully in the eyes and asked how much this foam cup cost. He wanted to buy it. Tristan, hearing this, turned to his boss in surprise. Why buy a thing that, it would seem, is completely unnecessary? Guan, looking at Zilkin, loudly exclaimed that this bowl cost 30 million. Zilkin threw the bill on the table with a thud and resolutely declared that he would take it. Smiling at all 32, the man began to sign, formalizing the purchase. Tristan grabbed Zilko by the shoulders and, almost frantically, shouted that he wanted to spend 30 million. With that kind of money, you could build a luxurious mansion from scratch in the capital. Zilka smiled and remarked to his employee that now, with only 30 million, he could make a soda cocktail at any time. And if he wanted, he could even open his own bar. Zilk added that there were literally hundreds of ways to use the thing. Guan smiled and reassured the buyer, promising to find a worthy use for it. Now he could take the bowl. Tristan, with a cry of indignation, could not believe that he was spending so much money on a cup in front of such a poor man as himself. Zilk only mocked his condition. Did he not feel ashamed at all? In response, Zilk remarked that Tristan was left without money only because of his own financial irresponsibility. After that, Zilk glanced sideways at the check he had just received. He thought with a smile that he loved making such purchases. If he had a wife or children, they would probably reproach him for being wasteful when he had to take care of his family. Zilka continued that single people are exempt from all responsibility. He intends to live exclusively for himself. What happiness it is to not be concerned with any worries that may accompany family life. Tristan exclaimed with delight that it was finally time for dinner. But Zilk calmly replied that he was heading home. Tristan, with eyes full of tears, asked loudly why he was being denied food. Zilka, looking at the boy, calmly replied that he was not going to carry an artifact worth 30 million with him. Tristan exclaimed sadly that Zilk was in a hurry to take advantage of this. And unfortunately, he was right. Zilk, heading for the exit, did not deny this. He sincerely apologized, promising that next time he would definitely make amends. Guan and Tristan glanced at the door through which Zilk had just appeared. After thinking about it, Guan noted that Zilk had considerable wealth and was simply beautiful, but with such looks, he was never destined to marry. Tristan sighed sadly and agreed that this was the absolute truth. When Zilk returned home, it was already dark outside the window. The boy placed the bowl on the table and exclaimed with delight, "It shines like a real treasure." Zilk smiled in return and noted that the bowl looked simply luxurious. The young man carefully rubbed and shook the strange object in his hands, curiously wondering what it was made of. Zook smiled mysteriously and noted that now, at any moment, he would be able to enjoy sparkling water. Examining his bar, the young man was sincerely happy and confidently confirmed, "Yes, without a doubt." Zilk loudly announced that he would make a highball cocktail now. Zilk opened the refrigerator drawer and took out a large block of ice. He placed it on the table and took out a knife and a hammer. Zilk admitted that he had originally intended to use magic to do this, but decided that he could do it on his own. The guy used tools to cut the ice block into several neat cubes. He exclaimed happily that he had done it perfectly. Meanwhile, Zilk poured a few ice cubes into the glass. The guy unscrewed the bottle, poured the strong drink into a glass with ice, carefully swirled it in his hand, and then looked at the glass and said, "Fill yourself up." The boy looked with joy at the fizzy drink that had magically appeared in the magic cup. He carefully poured the fizzy liquid into a glass. Zilk sipped some of the potion and immediately grabbed his head. Deep in thought, he suggested that he might try to conquer the high serve. In the meantime, the guy decided to cook something tasty. He placed the plate on the table with a smile, saying that fried chicken would go best with the drink. Zilk grabbed a piece and instantly sent it to his mouth. Zilk exhaled and exclaimed that it was really hot in here. Without stopping, he continued to eat his dinner with pleasure. He added cheerfully that the ginger and garlic seasoning was simply impeccable. He noticed that it was time to sprinkle the chicken with lemon juice. Zilk took the lemon and carefully squeezed the juice directly onto the chicken meat. The young man took a bite of the chicken and thought with pleasure, that this dish would taste even better with lemon. Zilk grabbed his glass and took a few sips. He slammed it on the table so that there was a loud crack. The man exclaimed that now you can't think of anything better. He greedily grabbed the magic cup in his palm. Zilk emphasized with delight, such a luxury, and all for only 30 million. The young man believed that this was the natural outcome of his aspirations to lead a luxurious free life. He convinced himself that he had finally fulfilled his cherished dream. Zilk raised his glass, proposing a toast to all his efforts, which had ultimately led him to a happy life. It flashed through his mind. A lot of interesting things had happened today. It was during the concert that the idea for a new cooler first came to his mind. He managed to attract a musical instrument to his business. The guy reasoned further. He managed to buy this expensive bowl for only 30 million, having received it from Guan almost for free. Zilk solemnly raised the magic cup and exclaimed with delight that today had brought him incredible joy. May all his dreams continue to come true. The guy didn't calm down and, raising his voice, assured me that next time he would definitely take a spritzer. Zilk took a deep breath and sang loudly. His singing echoed far, all the way out into the street. A girl named Katarina finally returned from her performance. With a tired sigh, she announced that she had finally made it home. Katarina sighed wearily, admitting that she was exhausted to the point of exhaustion. Suddenly, she slapped herself on the cheek and cried out in anguish that she had to stop. She had to concentrate on the music. That was her entire focus right now. The girl believed her name was Katarina McClear. She continued her story, confessing that she had left her family home and was living on her own to find her own way in the world of music. She took off her shoes in exasperation. Katarina confidently declared that it was impossible to hold on in the world of music if she did not learn to endure loneliness. She had to hold on as long as possible. However, the sharp pain in her leg was not letting her rest. She rubbed her foot in her shoe. Katarina sank down on the floor exhausted, trying to rest and gather her strength. She got to her feet and walked wearily to her room. Glancing around the chaos she had made, Katarina muttered quietly that she had never seen such devastation before. It was time to finally start cleaning. Katarina recalled how, as a child, the servants did everything, and she never had to lift a finger. The girl admitted with regret that because of this, she never did anything on her own. Neither cleaned her own room, nor did she wash or fold clothes. Katarina sank heavily onto the sofa, and, burying her face in the pillow, exclaimed that she would definitely do it next time. But unfortunately, not today. Covering her head with the blanket, she sighed wearily. She muttered that it was time for her to sleep. The girl lay still for a few more seconds, and then suddenly jumped up from the sofa. Katarina threw off the blanket and exclaimed loudly that there was no question of sleep. It was too early. She was terribly hungry. She glanced at her food. In front of her lay wilted and dried vegetables that should not have been eaten for a long time, and also a piece of meat of dubious origin and unknown freshness. Katarina turned away from the spoiled food and said that it was probably better to skip dinner today. She glared angrily at the refrigerator and complained that it couldn't store food forever anyway. With an ironic smile, she added that, for all its capacity, its creator could have made this unit at least a little less bulky. She has already sent requests to its creators, Zilka, more than once. In the letter, she complained that the switch on the stove was too tight. It was difficult for a woman to turn it. She also asked to be allowed to use the dryer when she was away. Could they make the device more compact? Katarina noted that, in her opinion, the updated products were not yet available for sale. The girl sighed, picked up the violin, and said seriously that now was the time for her to practice and hone her playing. The girl stepped into the room, which was equipped with a magical soundproofing device that kept the melodies from leaking out. She unfolded her notes. She had just started playing when a loud noise came from the neighboring apartment through the wall. Glancing indignantly at the wall, she muttered discontentedly, "Who's making that noise again?" It must have been some man. She shouted that she really needed to concentrate. As soon as Katarina started playing, loud singing could be heard again from the next apartment. Someone was shouting songs at the top of their lungs. Feeling a surge of anger, she slammed her fist against the wall with all her might, hoping to finally make the uninvited singer shut up and leave her alone. The girl grabbed her leg and, screaming in pain, rolled across the floor. The man kept humming, and Katarina stared at the wall in displeasure. She pressed her cheek to the cold surface and shouted loudly that if he liked to sing so much, he should worry about soundproofing. In the next apartment, Zilk continued to sing. Zink was leisurely strolling through the cozy streets of the town, and decided to stop by a small cafe for a bite to eat. He wanted solitude and a calm atmosphere, away from the hustle and bustle. Looking out the window, the boy realized that this was exactly the place he had been looking for. Inside, there was complete freedom, so Zinc could be alone as long as he wanted. With his suitcase in hand, he walked to the entrance and looked at the sign. The name seemed unfamiliar to him, and the boy wondered if this coffee shop had really always been here. As soon as the guy crossed the threshold, a neat employee immediately approached him. The barista of this establishment, a man in an ironed shirt and a well-groomed mustache, politely suggested that Zinc choose any free table he liked. The boy entered the hall and looked around intently. He immediately felt an unusual silence and peace spread around him. After flipping through the menu and reviewing the offers, Zinc decided without hesitation. Tomorrow he would order a regular set, and now all that remained was to choose a drink. After standing for a while and looking around, Zinc caught a familiar aroma in the air. He noticed a man who was intently cooking something, pouring boiling water over the ingredients. Surprised, Zinc asked the owner what the smell was. Was that really coffee? The owner also looked at the boy in surprise. His eyes widened in surprise. The barista was surprised that Zinc was even familiar with coffee. However, he calmly replied that he had tasted it many years ago, so he remembered its unique aroma perfectly. Coffee exists in this world, but it has not yet become popular among people. Zinc had long since drunk all the supplies of the drink he could find in the capital. He raised a cup of hot drink to his lips, enjoyed its aroma, and took a sip. However, he immediately grimaced. "This is not the same at all," the boy muttered. "The beans need to be ground." After that, the barista agreed with him and poured the ground coffee from the coffee grinder. The man behind the counter put his hand to his chest and admitted that he had tasted this a long time ago. Back then, he was still traveling the world. And it was then that he had the desire to open his own coffee shop to devote himself to his favorite business. But he still did not give up. The coffee shop did not attract visitors yet, but the man did not stop his attempts and continued to experiment. Zinc supported him, noting that few people were able to immediately see the full charm of the drink. Moreover, Zinc was convinced that the locals did not know how to get real pleasure from drinks at all. He turned to the owner again and asked him to make him some coffee to complete his breakfast. The man smiled happily and assured that from now on he would take care of everything. The owner was pleasantly surprised to feel that for the first time in many years of living in the capital, someone shared his enthusiasm. The man took a special kettle and began slowly pouring freshly boiled water into it. The stream of hot liquid gradually filled the lower flask, and its glass walls were immediately covered with a light haze. Then, freshly ground coffee was poured into the Turk. The grind should be neither too fine nor too coarse. The man measured out approximately 12 grams of coffee beans. Then, attaching the upper flask and securing it securely with a rubber connector, he set everything in place. The water boiled, and the hot vapors slowly lifted the liquid up to where the ground grains were waiting. In order for the coffee to reveal its flavor, it must be constantly stirred with water. This way the drink is prepared faster. Even when the fire under the vessel goes out, drops of aromatic liquid continue to slowly pass back down through the filter for some time. And in the end, the owner received a real masterpiece. Fragrant coffee with a unique taste, which was achieved thanks to a special preparation method. Concentratedly and carefully, he began to pour the drink into a cup. Then he took the cup, along with the rest of the drink in the flask, and returned it all to his tray. Soon the barista brought a new zinc glass, and the aristocrat thanked him politely. The coffee he tasted was strikingly different from the one he could make himself. The colorful color of the drink was captivating, and the aroma was surprisingly clean. No sourness, just a pleasant richness. Zinc placed his hand on the counter, smiled, and remarked that the coffee was exceptionally delicious. The owner sincerely thanked him for the compliment, as he was quite nervous about preparing a drink for someone who had already tasted his coffee before. The owner of the coffee shop approached Zinc, asking his name. He noted that few people in these parts liked coffee. Then the man placed a ready-made breakfast in front of the guest and, smiling, introduced himself. His name was Rondel. Zinc reached for a cup of coffee, and then, with a slight smile, introduced himself to Rondel. "I'm Zilk. Laurent." He was extremely pleased to finally meet the owner of this establishment. Moreover, hearing his name, Rondella was surprised. Meanwhile, the man asked Zinc what he did for a living. "Rumor has it that Zinc is a famous inventor," Rondell smiled broadly and remarked that it was a real honor for him to host such a famous inventor of magical artifacts in his cafe. Zinc was a little embarrassed, looked away, and smiling uncertainly, replied that there was nothing special about it. Soon, the coffee shop door suddenly opened, and another man in a sleeveless shirt confidently entered the room. It was Mr. Noid. Holding his coat in his hand, he noticed that his host had not appeared for a long time. Finally, he had the opportunity to take advantage of the long-awaited day off. Rondell greeted Mr. Noid. The owner, noting that the butler's job was not easy, was pleased to see him. The butler, meanwhile, glanced at Zinc, who was standing behind the counter. As he approached, the man noticed that someone else besides him was ordering coffee today. He emphasized that such an event was a real rarity for this establishment, and then winked slyly. Zinc smiled contentedly, slowly enjoying his coffee. Noid leaned against the bar and asked the owner to pour him the same as Mr. Zinc. The next day, Zinc came to work. He carefully placed his briefcase on the table, adjusted his tie, and greeted his blonde colleague with a good morning. The friend was surprised to note that Zinc was in a surprisingly good mood today. Meanwhile, the man continued to sit, his head resting on his hand. Zinc exclaimed with delight that he was ready to reveal the reason to everyone. But his comrades coldly replied that they were not interested at all, so they were not going to listen. Zinc smiled and noted that the sparkling spring from the artifact he had acquired yesterday made a wonderful drink, perfectly paired with the fried chicken. Soon Zinca's secretary came into the office and began to calm Tristan, who was screaming so loudly that the walls were shaking. She calmly explained that Zinca had always been like this, and that this was not the first time something like this had happened. After that, she handed Zinc a letter, informing him that another complaint had been received about his invention. Zinc took the letter and asked who the complaint was from. The girl laughed and said it was from Katarina. Zinc's face instantly frowned, and his fingers began to grip the sheet of paper tighter. Tristan lost his patience. He pounded on the table, not holding back his voice. This complaint comes again and again from the same Katarina. The guys have already called her a real creep among themselves. Zinc recalled a vision. A jellyfish with a tangle of snakes on its head. This is exactly how he now imagined Katarina, who constantly poured out her complaints at him, not giving him a moment's peace. The girl said that this same Katarina had managed to take possession of all the magical artifacts that Zinc had created. Tristan was amazed to notice that she must be a real rich lady. Zinc, reading intently, noticed that he didn't care at all about the number of her purchases. A complaint is a complaint, and it's impossible to leave it unanswered. The girl also took back the previous sheets and noted that her complaints did not at all seem like she intended to offend or hurt anyone. The letters most often discussed various inconveniences during everyday use, as well as problems that prevented women from fully using these tools. Zinc thoughtfully placed his hand on his chin and noted that he completely agreed with that. The letters did indeed show flaws that the boys had overlooked when they were creating them. After that, the guy said that all this was complete nonsense. After all, 9 out of 10 women were completely satisfied. So, only Katarina had difficulties, so maybe the problem was with her. Tristan noticed that this girl knew absolutely nothing about magical artifacts. So why did she write so much about them? It was extremely difficult to change something in the drawings that had already been created. Zinc confirmed that everything is as it is. There is not a single unnecessary detail inside the magical instruments. It would be worth removing at least something for the sake of compactness, and the mechanism would lose its power. The girl exclaimed with enthusiasm that they should work hard, strive for perfection, and find a way out for the well-being of other clients. In her opinion, this was the true mission of their office. Zinc just casually brushed the letter aside, saying he didn't care. He wasn't going to listen to any more reproaches directed at him. The boy threw the crumpled sheet of paper into the bucket, which was already almost full of various complaints. Zinc noted that he created magical tools solely for his own convenience. Several actors gathered in the dressing room, getting ready for the performance. At the same time, they were thinking about going on vacation together, although not everyone will be able to escape. Katarina admitted with a laugh. During the rehearsal, she almost fell face down on the floor. After that, the girl quickly gathered herself, put everything she needed in her bag, and quickly rushed to the exit. Katarina said that she would be home soon, and that she definitely needed to get some exercise. One of the orchestra members entered the room and addressed the girl. It was the conductor himself, Eldoba. The man beckoned her to him, asking her to step outside for a moment. Katarina turned around sharply, looking around in confusion. What had happened? The girl suspected that Aldoba had noticed her inattention at rehearsal and how she wasn't putting in her best effort. The conductor handed the girl a piece of paper and noted that she had long been passionate about creating music. He decided to support her passion and encourage her further musical explorations. The girl immersed herself in reading what was written. And at that moment, the man put his hands behind his back and said that they needed original music for the next concert. Usually he composed it himself, but now he had a lot of other things to do. The girl watched the conductor with fascination, unable to believe that he trusted her so deeply. Aldoba explained that he had entrusted this matter not only to her, but if her piece turned out to be the best, the orchestra would perform it. Katarina radiated confidence and determination, so she agreed without hesitation. Aldoba smiled approvingly and gestured with her hand to show the girl that she had exactly 1 week to complete this task. After that, Aldob told the girl with an ironic smile that he was well aware of how difficult it was to write music, but rehearsals should be given no less attention. Then Katarina realized that he had noticed her indifference during classes. The girl hesitated whether she would be able to cope with this task, but she understood that there might not be another opportunity. In fact, she had no choice. She had long dreamed of creating her own music, so she took a piece of paper and carefully began to study the rules. The girl raised her hand, clenched it into a fist, and exclaimed that this was where her talent would shine in full force. Catherine McClure was boldly preparing to receive the title of Honored Composer. After long reflections on what her project should be, the girl clutched her head in despair. She realized with horror that there were almost no fresh ideas left in her thoughts, only emptiness. 6 days passed, and the girl still hadn't come up with anything new. She was tirelessly searching for inspiration, desperately sitting on the couch in her room. It was already dusk outside, and she hadn't even started rehearsal. Soon the girl began to get angry with herself, deciding to finally take control of everything. She realized that she needed to calm down and act decisively. Today she would skip dinner, sacrifice sleep, but she would definitely complete what she had planned. Taking the violin in her hands, the girl thought that first she should play at least something. Perhaps then her thoughts would flow in the right direction. She felt again how this task required extraordinary concentration from her. From the very beginning, she closed her eyes and carefully released the sounds from her instrument. At first, the melody did not flow as harmoniously as she would have liked. She persistently took up the task again and again, until she finally felt her own rhythm and confidence. Gradually, the girl immersed herself in the process, and the melody seemed to flow from under her fingers. She noticed that the rhythm came out quite well. Katarina spent almost the whole night on this task. Finally, grabbing the sheets of notes, she exclaimed in delight that everything was ready. Evaluating her work, she admitted that she had done an excellent job. However, she was suddenly overcome with doubt. After all, it was not her own song, but a neighbor's melody, which she had only arranged into notes and carefully transcribed. As it turned out, music had accompanied Katarina since childhood, but the melodies that came from her neighbor seemed to her something special and unlike anything she had heard before. A thought flashed through her mind. What if her neighbor was a famous musician? Fearing that she would be accused of plagiarism, the girl scattered all the sheets of paper around the room, categorically declaring that she would not hand in this work. Pride did not allow her to use this melody. Taking the instrument in her hands again, the girl confidently decided that a new melody would definitely be born easily, because she had already warmed up well. Meanwhile, deep night reigned outside the window. The next day, Katarina rushed to music class. She ran into the room with her hair disheveled and barely able to catch her breath, immediately apologized for being late. In the very center of the office stood conductor Aldoba, his pointer clutched in his hand. He turned to the door and, addressing Katarina, calmly informed her that she should not worry. Not everyone was gathered yet. Katarina ran into the room and quickly took her place. Aldoba turned to her again, reminding her that there was a music exam scheduled for today. He asked if the girl had managed to complete all the tasks and received an affirmative answer. Katarina assured him that she would bring everything she needed right away. Hastily unzipping her bag, she accidentally spills the entire composition onto the floor. Katarina hastily apologizes for her clumsiness. Aldoba approaches, starts collecting the scattered sheets, and smiles. She said that she had been up most of the night finishing the final part. Her husband carefully studied her work, lost in thought. Katarina, frozen in tension, waited impatiently. The work couldn't get out of her head. She was overly worried about how everything would turn out, and meanwhile, Eldoba, turning over the pages, kept changing his facial expression, now surprised, now frowning anxiously. Suddenly, it occurred to Katarina that in the morning, while hastily getting ready, she had mixed up the notes. Instead of the final version, she had put the first version of the piece on the music stand. Frightened, she reached for the sheets, but the conductor stopped her before she could, stopping her with a gesture of his hand. He silently signaled the girl not to make a sound for now. Meanwhile, the conductor stared intently, even with admiration, at the melody, completely immersed in the music that had struck him. Suddenly, delight flared up in Eldob's eyes. The man admitted that this work amazed him. The first was mediocre, but the second was a real find, fresh and original. The girl realized with surprise that it was the very work that she had created herself, and it was permeated with that living sincerity. She looked thoughtful and gloomy, and Elgoba remarked that he would show her to the others, and together they would finally choose the second option. The second alternative was a melody composed by the girl's neighbor. Katarina fervently pleads that this particular piece not be selected for public performance. Zielka was already sitting in his seat in the concert hall. Serious and focused, he waited for the musicians to begin their performance. Meanwhile, a large audience had gathered in the hall. When everyone started playing the song, Zilk was surprised to realize that it was so reminiscent of music he had enjoyed in a past life. It was incredible. Conductor Eldoba continued to wave his baton, clearly setting the tone. Zilk felt that if he only listened more carefully, he would certainly understand it down to the smallest nuances. The boy closed his eyes and surrendered to the sensations. Soon he recognized the same melody, exactly as it had been then. Its notes gently touched his memory, invoking sweet nostalgia for the happy moments before reincarnation. In the end, Katarina created a wonderful composition. It was the same melody she had listened to as a child, sitting by the window and involuntarily eavesdropping on her neighbor playing. The entire orchestra team was filled with joy and emotion. The musicians exclaimed to the girl that tickets for the next concert had sold out as soon as they went on sale. It was a real sensation and a grand success. Katarina began to feel embarrassed, and in the meantime, everyone was competing to remember how the girl had previously said that she dreamed of writing her own work. Who could have imagined then that her debut creation would immediately become a real masterpiece? The girl was immediately surrounded by people with joyful smiles and began to sincerely congratulate her on her victory. Katarina, embarrassed, thanked everyone who was around. Soon, the conductor Eldeba raised his hand and waved to the girl, attracting her attention. He called out to Katarina, inviting her to come to him for a moment. The girl leisurely made her way through the crowd. As she approached another adult man standing next to Eldoba, he suddenly appeared before her. He turned to the conductor and asked who the author of this amazing melody was. Eldob, with a smile and a certain modesty, announced who was standing next to him. He gestured to his companion and introduced him as Marco Monpuccino, the director of the opera house, a man extremely well known in artistic circles. Katarina smiled, gracefully crouched in a slight curtsy, taking the hem of her dress with her fingers. The girl sincerely admitted that she was glad to meet him and immediately introduced herself. She quickly realized that she was facing one of the key figures in the local musicians' circle. Marco admitted that it is moments like these, when young talents are revealed to the world, that always make his heart tremble with delight. Then Marco solemnly raised both hands, pointing his index fingers toward the ceiling. The man noted with gratitude that thanks to Katarina, his opera house had become the talk of the town. Marco, still smiling, put both hands behind his back and declared that he could not miss such a wonderful opportunity. However, at first, Katarina did not understand at all what was being said. Marco spread his hands wide and suggested that the girl write another essay. He added with a smile that he realized how difficult it would be to surpass the previous one, but he was convinced that she would definitely succeed. Marco Baididi confidently headed for the exit. With a joyful wink, he turned to the girl and asked if she could repeat her achievement. Katarina readily agreed. Later, the girl returned home, overcome with emotion. Today, she managed to impress both her friends and her elders, so success is undeniable. However, a new task awaited her ahead. She had to write another essay. She clutched her head and screamed. The girl clearly realized that she could not surpass the musical composition that was playing at the concert. Besides, she remembered how Eldoba had remarked on the sincerity in her own composition. The girl was certain, with her abilities, she would hardly be able to impress even the average listener. What to say about Eldoba's or Margot's exquisite taste? there was no reason to hope for it at all. Suddenly it occurred to her that she could listen to her neighbor's song again and turn it into her own arrangement, breaking down the melody into notes. So after the rehearsal, the girl returned home and spent the whole day secretly listening to her neighbor, hoping that he would finally sing something. The girl took her instrument and stood for a long time by the wall. She could not recognize the melody that was coming from there. Surprisingly, the neighbor was surprisingly reserved today, and that was not enough. Soon she was back to making her own music. Katarina wondered if it would be better to admit that she couldn't come up with anything new right now and just put it aside for later. But if she didn't hear her neighbor today, who knew when he would sing again? The girl encouraged herself, deciding that she had to take a chance. The girl left the house and immediately headed to the neighbor's door. Leaning against it, she listened intently, trying to catch the familiar melodies of the song. As the girl was kneeling by the door, she suddenly noticed that the noise had stopped. At the same moment, the door began to slowly open, and its sudden movement pushed her to the floor. The man looked out the door and stared at the girl sitting right on the threshold of his house. Katarina rubbed her forehead and complained of severe pain. At some point, opening her eyes, she raised her head and saw a boy in the doorway. She froze in surprise for a moment, as did he, meeting her gaze. This neighbor turned out to be Zilka himself. Zilk was busy in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The boy opened the spice cabinet and began to carefully sort through the jars. He couldn't find the right ingredient. Eventually it turned out that he had run out of ground ginger. Zilk decided that this time he would have to make the fried chicken without it. But suddenly he abruptly closed the cupboard, gritting his teeth in irritation. Zilk assured him that without ginger the dish would lose its taste altogether. So he quickly straightened his clothes and decided to head to the store. Hastily throwing on his outerwear, Zilk rushed to the door, glancing at his watch out of the corner of his eye. The market was still supposed to be open. Although he hated these shopping trips, there was no avoiding them, and at that moment he bumped into Katarina, who was sitting by the door. Zilk hurriedly opened the door and accidentally hit the girl on the forehead, leaving a barely noticeable mark on it. Zilka was not yet acquainted with Katarina. The girl remained motionless in place, while the gloomy boy concentrated on wondering who this mysterious woman could be and why she was lurking at his door. The girl slowly rose to her feet, and Zilk silently looked at her, as if remembering something. He thought the face was familiar, but at the same moment he doubted. Perhaps it was all just a game of imagination. Katarina could not contain her anger. Her hands dropped, and a scream escaped her lips. She sharply ordered the boy to be more careful when opening the door. Her indignation was reflected on her face. Everyone could see it. Zilka lowered his eyes in embarrassment and folded his hands in front of him. The young man assured him that the girl had crept up to his door unnoticed, pretending to be just passing by. After that, Zook bowed slightly and admitted that he had no idea who she was. Later, the boy asked why the girl was so stubbornly hiding at his door. The girl stubbornly screamed, indignantly denying all the accusations. Zilka warned that if she continued to lie to him, he would immediately tell everything to the mansion's security, and then called her a stalker. The guy noticed that ordinary passers-by don't linger under someone else's door. Katarina fell silent. For a moment she was intently trying to say something, but at that moment, Zilk looked her piercingly straight in the eyes. With each passing moment, Zilk became more serious, and Katarina finally gave in. She folded her hands, apologized, and promised to tell everything if the boy promised not to complain to anyone. She lowered her eyes, sighing in disappointment. Zilka was sure that now she would confess everything to him. The boy promised to listen carefully to her and to keep her secret. Katarina shyly asked where they could meet. She said she lived nearby, but it was better not to invite guests to her house. Besides, Katarina added, it would be rather strange to go visit Zilk's. The young man was furious when he found out that the girl was his neighbor. After that, Zilka went out into the corridor and advised the girl to grab some outerwear. Once outside, he confidently led her towards the coffee shop. As soon as she crossed the threshold of Rondel's establishment, Katarina looked around with delight and exclaimed in admiration at how amazingly beautiful it was. Unlike her, Zilka was clearly annoyed by her loud presence. He mentally decided, next time he would definitely visit here himself. Taking off his coat, the guy asked the girl what drink she wanted to try. Katarina picked up the menu and began to look through it carefully. The girl admitted that she had not yet made up her mind, and, without taking her eyes off the pages, added that she had no idea what she would like. Silt continued to watch her behavior closely. Meanwhile, The boy, noticing that the girl hesitated for too long with her choice, was surprised to notice the opposite of his opinion. Finally, she voiced her choice. Rondel approached the table with a pen in her hands, ready to take the order. Zilk, smiling kindly at the owner, announced his desire to drink coffee. Katarina intended to choose green tea, but as soon as she heard the word coffee, she immediately enthusiastically changed her plans. The girl suddenly glanced at the menu and noticed that she didn't see coffee there. Zilk crossed his arms over his chest and explained that the drink wasn't on the standard menu, but it was in the special guests section. The next moment, Katarina abruptly closed the menu and announced that she would also order coffee then. This clearly amused Rondel, who, standing next to her, immediately smiled. Zilk, indignantly, began to prove to the girl that coffee was bitter and not to everyone's taste. If she had never tasted the drink, then she shouldn't start. Katarina confidently raised her hand even higher and proudly announced her name. She noted that green tea also has a bitter taste, so if they are similar, she will definitely be able to handle it. Finally, the girl reminded me once again that there will be coffee. Zilka exchanged glances with Rondel, who was still smiling. The man nodded, showing that he had heard the order, and immediately set about making 2 coffees. The girl reached for a handkerchief to carefully wipe her hands. Zook noted the elegance, lightness, and special grace in her movements. Katarina sat motionless, a smile never fading from her face. Their house was far from cheap, which meant that the girl either had a high-paying job or belonged to a wealthy family. The girl decided to break the silence between the guys and suggested, while they were waiting for their drinks, why not get to know each other? Zilka immediately supported this idea, saying that it was a great idea. Katarina was the first to speak, confidently introducing herself. I am Katarina Makler, the second daughter in the Makler family. Undoubtedly, she was proud of this origin. The girl did not forget to show off another achievement, her violin sounds in the capital's orchestra. Zilk crossed his arms over his chest, and, upon hearing the last fact about the girl, could not hide his surprise. He asked her again about her knowledge of the capital's orchestra, not taking his curious, somewhat dissatisfied look away from her. Later, Zilkuan plunged into memories of the past and remembered Katarina. It was then that he saw her. The guy said that he had recently met her at the theater. Katarina was sincerely happy to learn that Zilku had been present at her concert performance. Then she smiled charmingly, her hands folded under the table. The girl asked what the boy's name was, and Silt jokingly remarked that it was somehow strange to pursue someone without even knowing their name. The young man exhaled, folded his arms across his chest, and looked intently at Katarina. He calmly said that his name was Zilk Loren, and that he was the inventor of magical artifacts. The girls found themselves in front of Arkinda, who stood up resolutely, pointing her finger menacingly at her interlocutor. She exclaimed that she had sent countless complaints to his department, but nothing had changed. At that moment, Zilk narrowed his eyes with contempt, and the same complaints of Katarina began to surface in his memory again. Zilka stood up and sharply declared that Katarina was a real snake. He said that it wasn't enough for her to constantly send him letters at work, so now she was tempted to show up at his house as well. Katarina began to lose her temper and angrily declared that she had only just found out that she had been living next to Zilko all this time. If she had known about it earlier, everything would have turned out differently. Both interlocutors were furious to the point of tears. At that moment, Randall rolled up and thanked me for my patience. It was certainly inconvenient to intervene in such a scene, but it was also impossible to act without intervention. The coffee shop owner began to set out drinks on the table. The man added that he had also brought extra sugar and milk in case anyone wanted to make their coffee milder. Zilka turned to Rondel and thanked him profusely. At this time, Katarina raised her cup, noting that the coffee gave off a pleasant aroma. It was her first encounter with this dark drink. As she continued to inhale the aroma, she also noticed that the coffee was still hot, so she had to be careful. She slowly raised the cup to her lips and took a careful sip, savoring the drink. After taking a sip, the girl immediately grimaced and groaned in dissatisfaction. It was too bitter. Zilka only smiled indulgently. For him, such an outcome was completely predictable. Katarina began to insist that she could cope, as she had said before. But she admits, this is too much. Zilk leisurely sipped his drink, glancing at the behavior of the people around him. The man suggested that if the coffee seemed too bitter, he could add a little milk to make it milder and more pleasant to the taste. Katarina looked at the jug of milk and reached for it. The drink was also warm, so the girl decided to try adding it. Slowly and carefully, she began to pour the milk inside. The girl glanced indignantly into her cup and noticed that the drink had completely changed color. Zilk only smiled mysteriously and encouraged her to try it again. Katarina took another leisurely sip, slowly replaced the cup, and solemnly declared that the drink was simply wonderful. Her eyes were ablaze with genuine admiration. Katarina drank her cup in one go and confidently declared that she quite liked it. Zilk considered them lucky. If the girl had not liked the coffee, she might, in his opinion, have behaved too harshly with the host. Taking a sip and carefully setting the cup down, Zilk folded his arms across his chest again, ready to speak. He curiously asked the girl what had brought her to his door, if this time she wasn't going to file another complaint about his invention. Katarina was a little embarrassed, and excitement crept into her heart again. The girl hastened to assure her that she had no intention of complaining. She really wasn't doing this for the sake of any claims. Zilk reminded her again that he was waiting for the real reason. Katarina replied that the story was quite complicated and long, but she would be happy to share it if the interlocutor did not object. Zilk remarked that it would have been better if she had shortened it a bit. The girl told him everything, without withholding any details, and quickly finished her story. Zilk looked at her in astonishment and asked her if she really intended to use his song. Now the boy understood why the melody seemed so familiar to him. Seeing the furor, he concluded, if the girl's first song was a success, she was instructed to create another composition. Katarina nodded silently, bowing her head. Zilk did not stop there, curiously noting that the girl had come up with nothing better than to hide under his door and wait patiently for him to sing again. Zilka turned his head to the side, calmly declaring that he understood everything. In his opinion, the girl was not a stalker at all, but an ordinary spy. Then Katarina jumped to her feet and indignantly objected, "All this is complete nonsense." She shouted that the boy was the only one to blame, because his voice could be heard even through the wall. Zilk admitted this, but noted that it still didn't give her the right to sit at someone else's door. Despite his words, Katarina didn't move from her spot. She remained in the barrass, her hands folded in prayer, humbly begging for forgiveness. She wondered if Zilka was angry that she had used his song. Zilk got up from the table, put on his coat, and remarked that by entertaining everyone with his singing and distracting the girl from her studies, they were now even. Besides, he added, he was not a musician, and this song was not his creation. After that, Zilk turned around and announced that he was going home. Katarina did not understand the meaning of his last words, so she instantly jumped to her feet and quickly stopped him, grabbing the hem of his clothes. She wanted him to stay. The girl also got up from the table, noting that she might have just mixed something up. To this, Zilka just shrugged and denied. The song she heard was not his at all, as she thought. Zilk turned, looked at the girl in surprise, and then smiled back at her. He thought that if he told her the truth, she would think he was crazy. So Zilk just said that he was the only one in this country who knew her. At first, Katarina thought that this song was really known only to him. The girl grabbed his jacket again and enthusiastically assumed that the boy probably had many more such brilliant pieces. She assured him that she could play them all. Sielka declared that he was not interested in the matter and advised her to look for another fool. However, Katarina grabbed him tightly by the clothes, determined not to let go until he surrendered. Sielka resisted for a while longer, persistently advising her to deal with her troubles on her own, but he agreed anyway. The man turned to the girl, who revealed to him the truth about their agreement. Zilko showed some curiosity. He was eager to find out what exactly Katarina could offer him. Without taking off his outerwear, he settled back at the table and briefly said that he was ready to listen to her. The girl suggested that he entrust her with his songs, and she would perform them. In return, she promised to give him 40% of the fees for performances, and the profit from one work could reach approximately 300,000. Zilk thought about it, then said that it all sounded good, but he doubted that every tune would be profitable. Besides, he wasn't interested in money. As an inventor, he could always make as much as he wanted if he wanted. Katarina froze in surprise. It finally dawned on her that this guy really was capable of getting as much money as he wanted. After that, Zilk raised a finger and noted that the girl could offer him something truly unusual. For example, a valuable treasure or a mysterious artifact, since she came from a noble family. Katarina whispered something quietly to herself, pausing for a moment in thought. She remembered that if she was not mistaken, she really did have something. Zilk stood up abruptly and asked with interest what artifact the girl had. Katarina proudly announced that she has a sound garden, a device that can store up to 5 favorite melodies and play them at any time she wants. Zilka instantly understood what she was talking about. It seemed that the girl was referring to a device like a player or a radio that had existed in his past world. This topic interested him quite a bit. He accepted this deal without hesitation. However, Katarina noticed that this thing was not cheap. Zilka promised to give her as many songs as she wanted, and if that didn't suit her, he was ready to pay extra. Then Katarina realized this guy was simply a fanatic about artifacts. Later, she admitted that she often turns on the music on it herself to listen to her favorite tunes. Zilka stood up, smiling, and announced that this was the end of their conversation. He asked Katarina to let him know as soon as she had made a decision. The girl clung tightly to the boy's clothes. She replied that she agreed. She explained that her future was closely linked to Zilka, so such an agreement was completely acceptable to her. Returning home, the girl went into the apartment hidden behind the sound garden. It was already deep night outside. Soon she came out into the hallway, holding a small box in her hands. The device itself resembled a stereo speaker. Zilk took it in his hands and enthusiastically noted that it was a real technical masterpiece. He was delighted with such a deal. He grabbed it and hurriedly headed for his place, giving Katarina a short goodbye as he went. The girl, addressing Zilka, remembered the complaints she had written. She asked contemptuously if he had even read those books. Zilk admitted that he had not. Suddenly, Katarina exploded with indignation. Moreover, he emphasized that he had absolutely no free time. Katarina pointed to him and emphasized that he was the creator of magical devices. She noted that the most important thing was to listen to the wishes of customers, because improving his inventions should be his primary goal. Zilk noted that everything is much more complicated than it seems at first glance. He also noted that complaints should be formulated more intelligently, guided by logic, and not just by one's own emotions. Besides, before taking up the complaint, it wouldn't hurt for the girl to understand at least a little about how magical instruments work. After that, Zilk said goodbye and quietly closed the door behind him. When the door closed and Katarina remained outside, Zilka carried the speaker deep into the room. He was eager to quickly figure it out and understand the principle of its operation. The music garden was full of different buttons: play, pause, record, delete, rewind, and 5 more buttons for selecting melodies. In Silk's opinion, this device was no different from the player from his world. All the functions were there. Suddenly, the guy noticed that Katarina was treating this item quite carelessly. Dirt had already gathered between the buttons, and dust had hidden in the smallest cracks, which was difficult to wipe off. Armed with a rag, Zilk clearly disapproved of this treatment of the artifacts. As he continued to wipe the find, he mentally reprimanded Katarina and then assured the player now he could not worry. From now on, he would be treated properly. Once everything was set up and the sound garden was sparkling clean, Zil decided to try out the device. Catherine assured him that it was very easy to use. Glancing intently at the panel, Zilka instantly understood. The Roman numerals indicated the selected audio track. The principle of operation of the device coincided with how voice recorders functioned in his world. As soon as he pressed the first button, the room was instantly filled with musical chords. Zilka smiled, immersed in the long-forgotten sense of harmony he had been missing so much, and surrendered to a moment of peace. The first melody was played on the violin. Zilk immersed himself in the amazing artifact, wanting to make the sound more powerful. Finding the necessary switch, the boy deftly turned it to the side. The music suddenly boomed much louder. Zil couldn't stop cheering, spreading his arms wide and exclaiming that it was simply incredible. Now, he had to listen carefully to everything that was recorded here. If he didn't like something, he could always turn to his musician friends and ask them to rewrite the necessary fragment. But soon the guy realized the same violin sounds in all 5 compositions. It seems that this is a recording of Katarina herself. She played at home, during rehearsals, or even somewhere on the street. Soon there was a knock on the wall, and Zilk instantly stopped the playback. He turned around abruptly and shouted loudly, eager to find out what the neighbor was up to and why she was disturbing his peace. Katarina shouted back that the music was too loud. If he was going to continue listening to melodies through his garden of sounds, he definitely couldn't do without good soundproofing. The guy finally admitted she was right and apologized. Zilk had always thought that he would only need soundproofing for secret negotiations and business conversations. But this time the girls turned out to be the reason. They constantly complained that they were being eavesdropped on. Zil picked up the artifact again, his eyes flashing with a bright glow. The time had come to reveal its hidden capabilities, for quite possibly, there were more than one or two of them here. Most artifacts hide not one, but a whole series of secret possibilities that the owner has no idea about. Zilku once shared this interesting thought with Guan. The guy began experimenting with different ways of pressing buttons. At first he pressed them two at a time, then he pressed several at the same time, and eventually he started pressing everything he had at hand in turn. Suddenly, a voice came from the speaker congratulating the listener on successfully finding the sixth secret recording. At that moment, Zilk realized that this was exactly what he had been searching for so persistently. Returning the sound garden to the table, the boy listened to the recording again. The voice claimed that its owner was Selba McClure, and that he was the one who used this artifact. Now, address the listener directly. Note that most likely this audio is being listened to by Katarina's new friend, or maybe her boyfriend, or even her legal husband. This artifact was given to Katarina for her birthday. Apparently, the author of the note assumed that by the time it was found, he would no longer be among the living. It was probably Katarina's grandfather or great-grandfather. Zilk sympathized with this, because a granddaughter or great-granddaughter would pass the artifact on to the first stranger she came across. Words that sounded like a request came from the speaker. However, the voice insisted on not telling anyone about this, especially Katarina. And if the girl suddenly happened to be nearby, the same voice recommended that they immediately press the delete and pause buttons simultaneously. Zil listened carefully, and as soon as the voice mentioned that, in addition to his wife, he also had a mistress, Zil instantly, without hesitation, pressed the buttons with 2 fingers at once. The guy realized that he didn't want to worry about other people's troubles, but he couldn't reveal this to Katarina either. It seemed like she shouldn't know about it. Then Zilko's friends, colleagues from a company that manufactured magical artifacts, came to visit. The girls reported that negotiations with suppliers were dragging on. They said they would stay a little longer, and when it was already dark, they started to get ready to go home. Tristan offered to take Ridge, but she just shrugged, saying she didn't really trust him. Tristan burst into a scream, pointing his finger at Zilko. He loudly declared that their master of magical artifacts was actually only a B rank. Tristan added that even he himself was not that weak. Then Zilk offered the girl his artifacts for self-defense, assuring her that with them she would be able to repel any criminal if she was afraid of returning late. Rig thought this idea was a good one, as self-defense artifacts are often disguised as ordinary jewelry. Zilka noted that such items would not attract attention or interfere with girls' daily lives. After that, Raj reached out her hand and, smiling, said that she was afraid that her husband might be jealous if he saw the girl wearing jewelry from another man. She said that at home, the husband might ask about it. Kristen revealed that Zilko has artifacts worth millions. But while it may be justified in self-defense, wearing jewelry given to her by another man still seems inappropriate. Zilk looked at the girl with doubt and immediately noticed that this was not a gift at all. He only agreed to temporarily transfer the artifact for the safety of his subordinate. Afterwards, the guy emphasized that his assistants did not understand anything about this matter at all. But Tristan insisted that such a thing would surely break a man's heart. Reg was a little embarrassed, but he still said it was very sweet. Tristan agreed, albeit silently, but Zilk didn't notice anything unusual about it at all. After that, Zilk raised his hands and waved them. The man advised the boys not to bother him anymore and to go home more carefully. Rouge smiled and added that they had done a great job today. Zilka grabbed his suitcase and went outside too. A breath of fresh air, a leisurely walk, and when the boy looked up at the sky, he was stunned by its beauty. Suddenly the sky was full of stars. Once, in a past life, the bright lights of the high-rise buildings and streetlights had made it almost impossible to admire such beauty. The stars were lost in the city haze. Zilka soon lowered his head and shook it slightly from side to side. The young man suddenly realized that he had become so absorbed in his gaze that he had completely lost his bearings. He could not understand where he was and where the road led next. Passing a crooked sign, the boy noticed the words, Ice Rock. He was about to turn back to the main street but changed his mind. Perhaps it wasn't time yet. Zilk approached and carefully straightened the sign. The boy thought it must be some kind of bar, so we can sit around with drinks for a while and then head home in peace. Upon entering, Zilk immediately noted the beauty of the establishment. It was undoubtedly a bar. The spacious yet cozy space had a pleasant atmosphere. At midnight, there were almost no visitors. A man's figure stood out from behind the bar. As he approached the light, it became clear that he was the bartender. The girl greeted Zilko, who was still hesitantly standing at the entrance. Zulk looked at the girl and assumed that this beautiful, elegant elf had been hired only to lure customers. After all, there was not a single living soul in sight here, so the boy concluded that if there were no customers, then the quality of this place left much to be desired. He put his hand on the doorknob and noted that this was a women's bar, and therefore he had no place here. The elf behind the counter insisted that the guest must have at least one drink before leaving. She explained that simply leaving was a sign of extreme disrespect. Zilka turned around, decided not to remain in the dark, and still order himself a drink. And then he would finally understand what was wrong with this place. He went to the bar and sat down opposite the girl. Continuing to polish the glass, Alfaka asked the gentleman what he wanted to order. Zilk replied that it depended on the bartender's taste. The girl winked slyly, and a crystal sparkled in the air before her. Soon she waved her hands with graceful ease, and crystal snowflakes of various shapes and sizes whirled before her. The bartender looked surprisingly confident in her actions. Zilk noticed that the girl possessed ice magic, an extremely complex art that required extraordinary skill and concentration. At the same time, he was still surprised. How did this elf end up here, and what did she want? They did not take their enchanted eyes off the girl, amazed by her ability to conjure. There was no doubt about her skill. Suddenly she reached for a small plate, and as soon as she took it in her hands, shimmering ice cubes began to fall inside, one after another. When the girl put the bowl back in place, she began to pull bottles from the shelves. The guy carefully watched the girl's actions. His gaze lingered on the bottles, and he suddenly guessed. She was making him a daiquiri. It turned out that this drink is also known here. A little rum, lime juice, and a pinch of sugar. The girl had already added the rum and lime juice. All that was left was to pour in the syrup. The bartender reached for the small bottle and noticed a pale pink liquid inside. This confused the boy a little, so he hurried to stop the bartender, eager to find out what it was. The girl explained. It was the nectar of the 1,000-day flower. The 1,000-day flower blooms only once every 1,000 years, and its bloom lasts only a few hours, so it has an incredible, almost priceless value to this industry. Zilk was a little confused and asked again with some doubt. He had no idea that such ingredients were used here at all, but the bartender assured him it was with this nectar that this cocktail acquires the most refined taste. But Zook never noticed a blender in the bar while they were making this cocktail. He had no idea what the girl was going to do next. The bartender poured all the ingredients into a clear glass that looked like a shaker, then raised her hands. The glass rose by itself, and magic swirled around it, creating a vortex that stirred the drink. Silko thought there was too much witchcraft in this bar. The girl garnished the cocktail with a mint leaf, thanked him for his patience, and handed him the drink, announcing that the daiquiri was ready. Even the name remained the same. Zilka believed that the most important thing was taste. The drink looked luxurious, of course, but if the cocktail did not meet expectations, all the effort was in vain. The cocktail itself had to taste sour, and the ice in it had to be crushed into crystal crumbs. Zilk reached for the elegant cocktail glass, and holding his breath, carefully tasted the drink. He was overwhelmed with delight at what he had experienced. For a moment, it seemed as if he had been transported to the snowy mountains. Everything was perfect, the cool taste, the crystal ice, and the impeccable shade of alcohol. The guy was completely confused and was genuinely amazed. Zilk, raising his hand, pointed to the cocktail and exclaimed that the drink tasted simply incredible. The girl, smiling mysteriously, admitted that she was quite knowledgeable about this. After finishing his drink, Zilk remarked in surprise that he had never imagined how delicious a cocktail with a touch of magic could be. Without a doubt, the bartender had considerable experience and had spent a lot of time perfecting the recipe and his craft. After that, Zilk stood up a little, leaned his hands on the bar, and bowed slightly to the girl behind the bar. He apologized to her for calling the place a ladies' bar. The girl smiled and said that she wasn't surprised by this reaction at all. There are many similar establishments here. She also admitted that she deliberately likes to evoke mixed emotions in people with her actions. Zook smiled and winked at the girl, then casually asked if she would make him another drink like that. She just smiled mysteriously in response and assured him that it was not difficult at all. Zilka's laboratory. He was slowly perfecting his new magical coffee grinder, which he intended to use personally. Tristan pushed back his glasses and noted that Mr. Zilk was in a great mood again today. Zilk confirmed this, and Tristan wondered about the technician's recent find. Zilka shared with the boy the news that he had found a wonderful bar with a unique atmosphere. It was just perfect. Tristan immediately decided that Zilka would not take him there either. Later, Zilk shared the news. He had recently managed to get a unique artifact from a violinist named Katarina. These days seemed truly special. They greatly lifted Zilk's spirits and left a noticeable mark on his soul. Tristan stepped closer to the gentleman, his hands firmly on his hips. The man standing next to him said that he had long wondered what Zilk was doing. Rush suddenly appeared behind him, smiled mysteriously, and said that she was also incredibly interested in finding out the truth. Zilk picked up the tool and remembered a time he had tasted a drink called coffee in a coffee shop. It was then that he had the idea to create a device for grinding coffee beans. Zilka noted that, of course, he could have stopped by that coffee shop at any time to enjoy his coffee, but he wanted to enjoy the drink both at work and at home. This is what inspired him to create his own coffee grinder. Tristan looked at the boy in surprise. It turned out that they had no idea about coffee beans. Zilka remarked that in that case it was no wonder why the drink had not become popular in that country. Tristan exclaimed in annoyance that Zilka was again collecting some useless things that no one was interested in. Tristan suggested that it would be better to create something that would bring them wealth. After all, then Zilt could make many people happy, and the workshop would only benefit from it. To this, Zilt asked Tristan to be quiet, noting that sometimes he invents magical tools that are useful only to himself. Tristan ran up to Reg and started to get angry. Reg just sighed and remarked that Zilk always took the best for himself without asking others. Tristan thought that this thing would not be in demand, but Zilk got angry and sharply objected. Not everything in life revolves around money. Raj proudly approached the table and declared that it was her direct responsibility to sell what Zilk had created. She had no idea what the drink was in front of her, but she still intended to raise interest in this tool among customers. Zilk, without leaving work, noted with pleasure that the result completely satisfied him. A very short time passed, and the guy announced that he had everything ready. The final result: he had designed both a manual machine and an automatic version. Having finished his work, the boy immediately began to pack up, saying it was time to leave. This greatly surprised the regentrists, because in their opinion, it was still too early. Zil was about to go to the door, pulled on his coat and opened it a little. But then he turned to the boys and noted that he still needed to check that both coffee grinders were working. Then he turned to the boys again and said that they had been late at work yesterday, so today, once they had done everything they needed to do, they could leave early. Rouge waved back at him. Zilkin set out on a modest picnic, which he arranged for himself. He set up a small tent, grabbed a folding table, a chair, and a portable device that resembled a small refrigerator. When everything was ready, the boy finally took out of his bag what he had come here for. Placing a bag of coffee and 2 coffee grinders on the table, Zook decided not to waste time and immediately prepare himself a fragrant cup of this drink. The young man's solitude was broken by a blond boy who slowly approached the tent. Zil greeted him happily, noting that their paths had crossed again. Zilka silently stared at the boy, who seemed genuinely happy to meet him. Then he asked if he planned to live here, to which the boy immediately shook his head and explained that it was all just a coincidence. The man began to speak, wanting to make sure Zilk was listening. However, Zilk was lost in thought, wondering if all this was happening right now. At the very moment Zilk came here for coffee, this guy appeared. Suddenly another voice came. She turned to the blonde, calling him Edut. The girl approached and asked what was going on here and what the boys were doing. Zilka became even angrier, as he wanted to be left alone and did not want any unnecessary attention. The young man awkwardly apologized, explaining that this girl sincerely wanted to join them for the meal. Later, it all seemed strange and illogical to Gilk. After all, it was the girl who insisted on keeping him company, not he who invited her. The girl was sure that the guys had known each other for a long time. I began to scratch the back of my head awkwardly, confirming her words. The girl smiled and asked about Zilka's name. At this moment, the guy thought Zilka had never once addressed him by his first name, although he himself remembered her name well. Zilk bowed his head, took a deep breath, and introduced himself. His name is Zilk. Lauren? The girl exclaimed with genuine admiration. She happily admitted that she had heard that name many times, and began to tensely remember where exactly. She immediately declared that Zilk was the very talent who had invented many magical devices. Zilk squinted slyly and agreed. That was indeed the case, although he did not consider himself a genius. The blonde put his hand on his neck and said that Rouge was talking about her boss, and that boss turned out to be Zilk himself. Zilk was frankly surprised that Ate knew about Rouge. 8 smiled and spoke, noting that Reg often gave orders to gather resources. He believed that Reg was telling that boy about adventurers. Zilka said that he usually just told her what resources were needed, and where and how she got them. He didn't care. That was entirely her business. If something couldn't be found on the market, adventurers were hired to get it at any cost. 8 exclaimed, noting that this was a funny coincidence. The girl enthusiastically clapped her hands, and then, smiling, said that now it was her turn to get acquainted. Putting her hand on her heart, she said that she was also an adventurer, just like Eat. Her name was Marielle. After the girl said her name, Zilka only briefly remarked that he understood everything. Mario immediately began to complain about such a sluggish reaction, and Et, without hesitation, explained that this guy was not very prone to showing emotions. After that, Ate turned to the inventor of the magical tools, Zilk, and asked what he was doing today. The man's gaze fell on some strange objects spread out on the table. Zilka broke into a smile and proudly announced that he had a prototype of a magical coffee bean grinding device in front of him. So today he was determined to make real coffee. Zilk had not expected such a violent reaction, but Et suddenly exclaimed in surprise. He found it hard to believe that Zilk was actually going to make coffee. As it turned out, he was familiar with the drink. 8 began to introduce the girl to coffee. He said that the drink had a peculiar bitter taste that not everyone liked, but 8 was delighted with it. Therefore, his interest was quite understandable. After that, It leaned over to Zilka and began to ask him all the details of the device he had created. Zilka was gradually getting tired of this overly enthusiastic company. After listening to Zilka's story about the purpose of his instruments, Edik also said that he wouldn't mind a cup of coffee right now, even a little bit. Mario willingly joined in his wish. At that moment, Zilk raised his cup and thought, perhaps it would be better if several people tasted the coffee. Then he turned to the boys and asked them to bring their cups. Eat, delighted by this answer, instantly rushed to his tent. The boy explained that his cup was inside, and he would bring it here immediately. Marielle's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked Yit to grab her mug from her bag as well. Yit nodded and quickly ran towards the adventurer's tent. When he left and disappeared into the building, there was an awkward pause between the boys. Zilt kept grinding his coffee and rubbing the silence between his palms, feeling awkward. After that, he raised the coffee grinder to his face and inhaled deeply the aroma of freshly ground coffee. The young man was not surprised to see the girl's cup in its tent. It seemed quite natural. So they were left alone. Zilka was confusedly looking for topics to talk to Meryl about, not knowing where to start. The girl thought silently, trying to find the right words. Suddenly Meryl turned to Zilka. Surprised by their acquaintance with Ichi, she asked the boy how long they had known each other. Zilka explained that they had only recently met and were meeting for the second time. The man knew almost nothing about him. However, Meryl noticed that from the very beginning their conversation had resembled that of old acquaintances. Lowering her head, she quietly admitted that she rarely felt this joy, which was why she wanted to know more about their conversation. Zilka wondered what it usually was like. The girl explained that it wasn't that he was unfriendly. On the contrary, the guy was extremely kind, and you could always rely on him. But despite this, he seemed to deliberately keep aloof from the other members of the team, including her. For example, that day she literally had to persuade him to take her with him. Zilk said that during their first meeting, the guy persistently asked to treat him to Zilk's smoked meats. It was constantly searching for Meryl's mug. The girl was surprised by this, because that was what seemed most unusual to her, as if it was more open with her than with the others. Later, Meryl loudly appealed to the boy, pleading with him to teach her how to befriend Edens. She desperately wanted to impress him, but her efforts always ended in failure. In fact, that's exactly what Zilk thought. He said there was no point in asking him about it, so all these efforts could be stopped immediately. Even he didn't understand why he was having such an impact on it. Mario gripped her weapon tightly in her hands and declared that Zilk was undoubtedly hiding something. In the eyes of the adventurers, she caught an invisible thread that connected them with this man. Zilk himself remained completely confused about the girl's plan. She clasped her hands together and sincerely began to beg the boy to support her in this difficult ordeal for the girl. Eventually, the girl looked away in confusion, a little embarrassed, and quietly confessed that she loved Ida. In this way, she wanted to emphasize how valuable communication with this guy was for her. Zilk froze for a moment, then sighed heavily. He didn't want to get involved in this story at all, especially since he usually stayed out of other people's affairs. It suddenly dawned on the boy. At first he helped Katarina with the music, and now he was considered a real Cupid. Meanwhile, it continued to run with the cups with a smile, and decided to grab something that would go perfectly with the coffee. The boy looked down again, then delivered a speech that seemed to have been rehearsed in advance. Zilka, smiling, declared that he was single, and that the girl had only come to him for advice. Continuing to slowly turn the knob of the coffee grinder, the young man tried to convey to Maril that all this made no sense, because in reality, he could not do anything about it. What she heard so shocked Marielle that she involuntarily covered her mouth with her hand. Surprised by what she heard, the girl could not help but start questioning Zilko, because she was convinced that he did not have a wife. Zoke agreed to this, even though in reality he didn't even have a girlfriend he liked. Meryl slammed the table and, unable to contain her emotions, exclaimed that Zilk was a handsome man and a talented inventor of magical devices, so he seemed intelligent and wealthy. She honestly didn't understand why he was still single. Hearing from Meryl that this boy would supposedly produce a whole generation of geniuses, Zoax felt anger boiling inside him. And when she added that he would always have a lot of girls around him, Zoax's irritation only increased. The guy began to remember what always drove him crazy. As soon as a woman found out that he was still single, she immediately became an annoying matchmaker, considering it her duty to find him a mate. Zilka sincerely thanked the girl for her concern, but advised her to take better care of herself and Ita. But as he said this, he suddenly realized that he had once again untimely mentioned the same adventurer, about whom the girl was probably painful to hear. Mariel began to rub her chin thoughtfully. Ate and Zilk got along very well, and perhaps it was this similarity that made the guy push her away. Besides, she remembered something else. This Ate was already 28, and he had never been married. Mayuyu threw a sarcastic look at Zilko, but he continued to stubbornly turn away, avoiding her eyes. The young man exhaled and noted that there are many people in this world, besides us and Ida, who, despite their age, are also in no hurry to get married. Without stopping grinding coffee, Zilk remarked that perhaps, in time, one of them would reconsider their beliefs and meet their soulmate. Mary clenched her fist and said that now Zilka was telling her that it also wanted to remain single. Zilka just shrugged and said that the only way to know for sure was to ask the guy himself. Maybe he's never had a girlfriend he'd like to start a family with. But who knows? One day this joker might want to get married himself. Meryl did not back down and insisted. If he was really like Zilk, then what about her? What about the girl who dreamed of becoming his wife? Could she now simply give up her feelings? Zilka was already testing the second chopper, holding the lid firmly on top. He noted that if he wanted a stable relationship with Ait, he needed to be able to keep a certain distance between them. Mario couldn't understand how she could do that when she wanted to spend all her free time with Yit. Then Zilk began to explain the matter to her in more detail. He noted that single men of that age usually greatly value their own space and freedom, and also value their time. Therefore, it was extremely important not to overdo it. The girl should not pressure him with excessive demands. She should value his personal space and free time. When he himself feels ready, the initiative will certainly come from him. After that, Zook glanced at it and thought, it really did resemble him. Lonely people don't like to be held back or their freedom restricted. Zilk noticed that Art would quickly tire if she imposed herself on him every day, telling him that he had to be there and fulfill her every whim all day long. In addition, such people usually remain calm and balanced, avoiding situations in which their partner becomes overly emotional. Zilka noted that if he ever had to get married, he would definitely choose a relationship in which there is mutual respect for each other's interests and a value for personal time. Harmony should reign in his soul, and his companion should not give in to senseless emotions. No tantrums. He needs someone who will always be on his side and support him at any moment. The girl decided that in such a situation, a partner should not just be a soulmate, but a true best friend. Zilka noticed that it could be phrased that way, and then he began to summarize. In his opinion, if the girl tried to approach E too insistently without any warning, he would certainly run away from her. People of this type have a completely different outlook on life than most. Soon, E3 turned to the boys, a mug in each hand and a small bag clutched in his palm. Seeing them talking animatedly, he decided that they had already made friends in this place. Meryl immediately assured him that nothing of the sort had happened, and that it had misunderstood everything. The girl was afraid that he would think that she had feelings for Zilko. Meanwhile, Zilko himself was quite interested in the package the boy was holding. Eighth said that he had bought these cookies in town. The man remarked that the treats would go perfectly with coffee. Zilka smiled and started pouring a hot drink. He noted that this was a completely different conversation, and added that together they would certainly make the picnic surprisingly delicious. Soon, Zilk poured hot coffee for everyone present. Meryl immediately noted how wonderful the aroma of the drink struck her, and Zilk confirmed it with a smile. Meanwhile, it was already savoring the coffee with pleasure. Eight couldn't get enough of the taste of the drink. After taking a few more sips, he even exclaimed that this was exactly what he wanted to taste. The coffee was incredibly delicious. Marielle noted that the taste was bitter, but at the same time quite pleasant, and she liked it. Zilka smiled back, agreeing that the coffee was just right. It asked if there was any coffee left, and Zilka immediately assured him that he had plenty. The boys could drink as much as they wanted. It really did taste even better with the cookies. It took the cup in its hands and smiled broadly, saying that it was a pleasure to hear it. Meryl, like everyone else, was also happy with him. When the cups were empty, Zilk picked up the kettle and began pouring another drink. He assured them that it was also coffee, but this time they would taste it brewed in a different way. Ava tasted the drink and immediately noticed that this sample was much smoother and more pleasant to the taste. Meryl picked up on her opinion, adding that, like the previous coffee, this one also had an extremely rich, mouth-watering flavor. Zilk began packing the beans, deftly twisting the bag. It immediately became clear to him that his interlocutors had caught everything on the first try. Unlike the previous variety, this one was only lightly roasted and thoroughly ground. With pleasure, it admitted that he preferred the rich taste and liked the bitterness more. Meryl noted that she liked the second option, and Zilka noted that for him, the ideal combination is somewhere in the middle between these tastes. It smiled and joked that now it was time to make the perfect version. Zilk replied that if he used up all his coffee supplies so quickly, he would soon be without it. 8 pointed his finger at one of the coffee grinders and asked the seller to sell him this device. Zilka apologized, explaining that it was only a prototype, and until he made the necessary improvements, he could not sell it. Mariel did not hide her surprise. Could such a thing really be improved? Zil confirmed that, for example, it was possible to work on durability. Next, it was necessary to determine which material would be the best choice, but Zilk instantly found a compromise. He handed the guy a piece of paper. On it, Zilk explained, was written a wonderful coffee shop where you could taste an incredible drink. The guy exclaimed that this option was quite suitable for him. He took the sheet of paper with the diagram drawn on it and examined it carefully. The coffee shop was called Lundell's, and Eat thanked Zilka sincerely. When the picnic and the inspections were behind him, Zil headed to this particular coffee shop. The owner of the establishment warmly greeted him at the entrance, immediately smiling warmly. Zolk placed his suitcase on the counter, then dipped his hand into it. He asked the owner to give him a few seconds, promising to show him something interesting. Zilka pulled out 2 tools and placed them neatly on the table. He explained that he was trying to make some coffee grinders himself and would like to hear Rondel's thoughts on the matter. Rondel took one of the animals, which appeared to be quite tame, and began to examine it carefully. It was clear that the man was completely absorbed in his study, immersed in observation with his head. Finally, he shared his conclusions. This creature seemed to be much more compact than the specimen he had dealt with earlier. After that, he noticed that he didn't see a handle on the second device, and Zilk explained. Unlike the first, here the blades rotate independently. An automatic coffee grinder has an undeniable advantage. You don't have to grind everything yourself. This allows you to significantly reduce the time it takes to prepare a drink and serve coffee to a larger number of guests faster. Rondel smiled and remarked that the current coffee grinder wouldn't be able to handle the large number of guests. To this, the owner replied that he really liked such things. Rondel pointed to the second grinder, an automatic one, and asked if he could take a closer look. Zilk gestured that the lid was easily removed, and the structure itself could simply be disassembled. The man began to disassemble the automatic coffee grinder, remarking with an ironic smile that he had expected nothing less from Mr. Zilk. This device turned out to be much more complicated than the one Rondel had assembled. Later, Zilk curiously asked the audience what they thought of his inventions. Rondel, rubbing his chin, remarked that he couldn't give a definitive answer without the full picture. It seemed to him that this metal wasn't exactly suitable for making blades. After prolonged use, coffee beans acquire a metallic taste. Zilk began to carefully note down every detail. Zilk carefully jotted down every word that the coffee shop owner Rondel shared with him. When the notes were complete, he carefully tucked the notebook into his jacket pocket and, without wasting any time, decided to ask a question of his own. The conversation slowly turned to the coffee grinder. I immediately thought that it was probably not worth asking what Rondel had done it for. The answer would certainly be unpleasant. Rondel noticed how the boy hesitantly cut off his sentence mid-sentence. In addition, he personally admitted that he made the blades for his coffee grinder from the claws of a silver wolf. Sielka looked at the coffee shop owner in surprise. The man seemed to really understand him, so Sielka cautiously asked if he would share his knowledge. Rondel raised the blade in his hand and remarked with admiration how impressed he was with the grinder Mr. Zilko had created. According to him, this invention was a real breakthrough in the coffee industry. Rondel added, not hiding his smile, that he would be happy to help in any way he could. After all, the owner wanted coffee to gain wider popularity in the capital. Zilk felt boundless gratitude towards Rondel. He looked at him and sincerely said that he incredibly appreciated his host's openness and desire to help. Zilk leaned his palms on the counter and began to persistently question the owner. They say, Rondel did not say a word about his opinion. In response, Rondel said that he would be happy to use such a device. While Rondel and Zilku were talking enthusiastically, the door of the cafe suddenly opened. A man with glasses entered and walked resolutely to the counter. It was Mr. Noid again. Seeing the new device, he jokingly asked if they had started brewing coffee with all sorts of magical devices. Rondel explained that this coffee grinder had been made by his regular customer and good friend named Zilk. Mr. Noid turned to the man and immediately greeted him, placing his hand on his chest. He introduced himself. "My name is Mr. Noid. Nice to meet you." Noid, rubbing his hands, asked if the young man would mind if he learned his name. The guy briefly introduced himself. Zilk, Lurin. These names quite surprised the interlocutor. Noid pointed a finger at the boy and asked, "Isn't this the same eldest son of the Luron family, the renowned inventor of magical devices?" Zilka confirmed that the man was not mistaken. Noid assumed that Rondel had already tested his magic tool today. However, Zilka denied that this was not the case. Rondel was just using his coffee grinder, and his own was lying nearby. Noah turned to Rondel and asked if the owner would mind if he could try out the coffee for Mr. Zilk's coffee grinder. He asked if there was any chance. Rondel thought for a moment, then turned to Mr. Zilk. The owner said that if the boy didn't mind, he could take it on. Zilk just nodded, indicating that it didn't bother him. After that, Zilk modestly remarked that he wasn't sure if his coffee would taste as good as Rondel's, made in his machine. Noid smiled and assured me that everything was fine. He was a true coffee connoisseur, so he was not afraid to try new flavors and remained open to the unknown. Rondel grabbed the machine that Mr. Sielka had brought and began pouring coffee. He declared that in that case he would make a cup of fragrant coffee with the help of the new machine, accompanying the process with a cheerful chatter. Rondel started making coffee, and Zilk immediately noticed that the owner of the coffee shop was turning the millstone much more slowly than he himself did. This interested the guy. Perhaps it was this leisurely pace that was the secret of his unsurpassed coffee. Soon, the coffee was ready. Zilka and Noid each took a cup and carefully took a few sips. Zilka noticed that Rondel's coffee was still tastier than his own. Its taste was more refined, more noble. Rondel explained that the type of coffee bean can vary depending on humidity, temperature, and other conditions. Each variety requires a specific preparation method that reveals the unique notes and aroma of the drink. Ronel smiled again and winked at Zilka. The man admitted that he had considerable training in these matters, but even he still had many mysteries to understand and new skills to master. Zilk smiled and raised his cup again. The guy assured that even if the coffee became even more popular, Rondel's customers would not decrease. Noe, keeping the conversation going, nodded with a friendly smile. The heroes decided to test the coffee grinder in action. Zilk explained, "You need to pour the same coffee beans into it. Press and hold the button, and the machine will start working. As soon as Rondel releases the button, the device will immediately stop working." Noid watched the second installation with delight. In his eyes it seemed like a miracle from Legends. Rondell was a little nervous, but assured him that he was well aware of everything. After adding the freshly roasted coffee beans, Delvin carefully closed the lid and pressed the button. The coffee grinder made a noise, and both men watched with interest as the process began. Suddenly, the meat grinder trembled. Rondell was frightened at first, but instinctively grabbed it tighter, trying to hold it in his hands. Noid, his eyes wide open, opened his mouth in surprise, not losing his astonishment at what he saw. When Zook said it was time to release the button, Rondell turned off the grinder. Opening the lid, they looked inside together and saw freshly ground coffee. Rondell noted that the device is really convenient. Unlike a manual grinder, it grinds the grains extremely quickly. Too quickly, so the grind comes out too fine. Zilk noted that there are no universal settings yet. He designed the device only to speed up cooking. Rondo held out the cup and apologetically admitted that he had ground it too finely. Zilka assured him that there was nothing to worry about. He usually used a manual coffee grinder and had no experience with such devices, so now he would have to get used to this machine first. When the coffee was brewed, the men were already immersed in the whole ceremony. They carefully caught the subtle nuances of the aroma, and then moved on to tasting, savoring every sip. After taking the first sip, Zilk noted that hand-ground coffee had a richer flavor and a brighter aroma. They were then given regular coffee, but Noit noted that he would hardly have complained about it at home. Zilka smiled and said that once you've tasted the local coffee, you'll never want to go back to regular coffee. He admitted that he missed its aroma and its magical smell. Noah agreed, adding that the local brewing method was much more sophisticated. Turning to him, Zilka asked which of the two cups he had made he liked better. The hero asked the owner what his impressions were. Rondell stood at a loss. Where to start? He examined the electric coffee grinder carefully, running his finger thoughtfully along the blades, and voiced his opinion. He had an idea about the knives themselves. He didn't like their shape at all. Rondell explained that this speed of rotation generates heat, which can spoil both the taste and aroma. To avoid this problem, the shape of the blade should be changed. Rondell raised his hand and suggested making blades with variable shapes. That would be great. Plus, they could be adjusted to fit different types of tools. Zielka took out his notebook again and began to jot down something. He remarked that this information was incredibly valuable and that it would be worth writing down the expert's opinion. At that moment, he remembered Katarina, and he explained that this was exactly the kind of criticism he had been missing. Noit said that these devices are great in any case. Ron Delagreda was particularly impressed with the automatic meat grinder, because if it were improved, it would be a real help on busy days. Rendell added that the hand mill is much better than his own. The handle is much easier to turn, and you can adjust it to your preferences. This makes it easy to choose the right taste and aroma, as well as adapt to different varieties. Noid noticed that his friend didn't know anything about coffee at all, and now he dreams of buying this magical device. Zilk turned around and said he could sell the car without any worries. If the unfinished product suited him, he wouldn't worry. Then he asked, what about the friend he was talking about? Noid laughed, then wiped the traces of the wonderful drink from his mustache. He said that this acquaintance was Duke Albert Bland, and he was eager to please such a respected gentleman. The Blend family was renowned for its power and influence among royalty, and while Silk did not seek their patronage, he was not sorry that his coffee grinders had ended up in the hands of a true coffee connoisseur. Zilk smiled and handed his interlocutor his business card. The man advised Noida to send the order to the workshop and promised that everything would be prepared there as soon as possible. The next day, Zilk plunged headlong into improving coffee grinders and designing the perfect machine. The order for the necessary materials had already been placed and was about to arrive. Tristan was watching all this when the door suddenly opened. Raj burst into the room and, unable to contain his excitement, announced that they had received an order from very influential people. It was clear that the girl was beaming with excitement. Tristan could not help but cry out in surprise, determined to find out immediately who these tools were being prepared for. The boy was dreaming of wealth and shouted so loudly that even Zilk jumped from his seat, losing his concentration. The girl took out a piece of paper and began to read it out loud carefully. She warned that the boys would be surprised when they heard the information, because it was about a truly distinguished client. This was their first order from such a special person. The girl carefully studied the order, unfolded the sheet, and solemnly announced, their client would be Duke Albert Blunt himself. Tristan, unable to contain his joy, began to clap his hands. The coffee grinders were still being made when Tristan, unable to contain his emotions, exclaimed, "If this continues, orders will come even from very high-ranking persons, above dukes. After all, a magical device in their homes becomes something like a prestigious advertisement." Reg assured them that if they succeeded, their fame would spread far beyond the town. Moreover, if he liked the result, he would consider ordering the tools in batches for production. Tristan added with a twinkle in his eye that from now on they would make new instruments for him and repair old ones, so his annual income would certainly increase dramatically. The guys started dancing and celebrated joyfully, full of hope that only bright horizons awaited their workshop, and it would happen very soon. Zilk continued to fiddle with the instrument. The boys looked at him in surprise, for he seemed unusually strange today, even sickly. However, Tristan was not at all bothered by the increased attention from the nobility. Zilk patiently waited for the boys to calm down a bit, and calmly announced that he had learned about this assignment in advance, so he had already set to work and was improving the instrument. After that, Zilk asked Raj what was in that mysterious order. He replied that there was supposed to be a coffee grinder inside, and Raj immediately confirmed his words, emphasizing that this was exactly what had happened. Tristan immediately asked how Zilk had heard about the order. Zilk explained that it was a coffee grinder that he had originally created for his own use, but it had interested his friend. Zilk realized that explaining all this would take too long. The guys were surprised that the engineer agreed to give away the thing he had created for his own needs, and Raj meanwhile persistently began to convince him. The girl confidently stated that this assignment came from a particularly influential aristocrat, so she insisted that Zilk make every effort and without hesitation inform his team of all the details, hiding nothing. After that, Zilk told the boys the whole truth. Tristan was genuinely surprised. He had no idea that the Duke could be found in such a place, and Reg joked that Zilk used the walk to expand his business. Zil insisted that he had no intention of expanding anything. He claimed that he was just walking around town looking for a place to eat, but the girl didn't seem to believe him. Zilk clenched his fists when Reg told him that the Duke had ordered 5 manual coffee grinders and another 5 automatic ones. That was a great start for a first deal. If they could pull off the order, their names would surely become household names among the nobility. Raja's eyes lit up with excitement. As she had assured them earlier, the boys needed to make a perfect impression to interest a wealthy client. Tristan emphasized that their coffee grinders had to be the best. It was obvious that the boys were quite inspired by the fact that such an influential man had given the order. Tristan, in turn, assured them that he was ready to support the team and would do everything he could to help. Zil remembered how Tristan had advised him last week not to waste his time on all these useless things, and to get busy creating something truly valuable and profitable. Kristen smiled and said she didn't remember that. She added that everything Zilko created was a masterpiece that brought in a lot of money. Besides, he would still be doing it even without them. 2 weeks have passed since then. Zil could triumphantly announce that everything was prepared as it should be. His millstones now seemed much larger, resembling massive mechanisms capable of handling a powerful flow. Taking the advice of the coffee shop owner, the boy changed the shape of the blades and used a different material. To test the strength of the grinders, he asked Tristan to turn them with all his strength until the handle fell off. When he finally managed to create a reliable product, the boy sent a sample to the coffee shop owner, who approved. Tristan looked exhausted after this crazy marathon of work. Reg, beaming with happiness, noted that the team had done well and really tried. Zilk was also tired and, waving goodbye, announced that he was leaving. Reg instantly grabbed his shoulder. Zilka gave her a focused look, expecting an explanation. The girl explained that, in her opinion, the creator should deliver his creations in person. Zilka turned around and said in surprise that he had no idea why he was doing this. The man replied that it was a perfectly normal request, whereupon Rouge grabbed him roughly by the face. The girl smiled and then frankly stated, if Zilk didn't go anywhere, he would as usual just hang around and waste time. Her face changed at these words, and she continued, remarking that, among other things, she was surprised how Zilko had even thought of not delivering the order to Duke Bland himself. At the end, the girl almost screamed with indignation. Zilk, instead of coming personally, had sent some commoner to the Duke, his assistant, and one at that. After such pressure, Silt gave up and raised his hands. Beads of sweat rolled down his face, and finally he admitted that he agreed. The guy will go with Reg to deliver this errand. So, leaving their workshop, they set out for the wealthy district where the Duke of Bland lived. As the travelers approached, they saw a huge, luxurious villa, dazzling in the sun. As soon as they crossed the threshold of the estate, they came across a butler who kindly offered to take the boys to the Duke. Behind them, they were rolling a small cart, loaded with a box of goods. The butler rushed forward. Zilk turned to the girl and remarked that apparently, this estate was just a place to relax. In fact, the Count's possessions extended much further. At that moment, the door suddenly opened. A familiar figure appeared on the threshold. Ridge kept thinking about Zilk's words about the fact that this was not all the land that belonged to the Blends. At the very entrance, a regular at the Rondel Café, Mr. Noid was already waiting for them. He placed his hand on his chest and, bowing slightly, politely greeted Mr. Zilka. The girl looked at him in confusion. She came closer and immediately joined the conversation, greeting the girl warmly. In response, she introduced herself. It turned out that she worked for Mrs. Zilka, responsible for sales issues in the office. The man also introduced himself. His name was Noid, and he served as butler to the Bland family. He shook their hands cordially, and they all bowed politely in return. When everyone had finished exchanging greetings, Noid gestured for the boys to follow him. He pointed to the large doorway that led to the main hall. Finally, the man led the boys into the living room, insisting that they sit down. Rogan settled himself with relief on the luxurious, spacious sofa. Zilk couldn't understand what all the fuss was about and why they were wasting his time. One of the men explained that they had brought special coffee grinders and that meeting the Duke was not part of their plans. At this, Noid suggested that they stay here and wait for the Duke. Mr. Albert was eager to see Zelkin in person, and if the guests were not in a hurry, Noid was ready to go and call him at once. Zilka turned his head and announced that they were in a hurry. At that moment, Rouge swung her hand sharply and slapped him painfully on the leg, ordering him to sit down and be quiet. Sielk smiled and assured him that he was only joking. A smile instantly appeared on Rag's face, and Sielka added that he himself would be interested in meeting the Duke. Noid bowed again, and sincerely thanked the boys for the opportunity and their time. He said that in that case he would ask them to stay here for a few more minutes until they returned. When the butler left, Reg continued to smile contentedly for a while. As soon as the clerk left, she instantly turned to Zilko to speak to him. The girl screamed, claiming that Mr. Albert himself wanted to see him, but Zilk stubbornly refused. Then she angrily blurted out, Zilk's mind was only emptiness and nonsense. Zilka insisted that it was just a joke, but Raj knew him well and didn't believe it. The girl, on the other hand, insisted that Zilka was serious and was about to leave, but Zil seemed to distance himself from his assistant, assuring him that he understood everything. Now that I was trying to stop her screams, Noid might have left, but there were other servants left to hurt them. The girl noticed the surprise on Zilkin's face and asked if he was really speaking sincerely. An uncomfortable feeling came over her, and Zilkin decided that she simply did not believe him and considered his words a fabrication, told only to keep her quiet. Zilka and Rouge continued their conversation in the living room, when suddenly there was the sound of the door opening. The same two men the boys had been waiting for so long entered the room. The host of the house greeted his guests. It was Albert Bland himself, the patriarch of the Bland family. The young man stood up in response, and Zilka solemnly introduced himself, adding that next to him was his subordinate, Rouge. The young girl, who had always tried to be polite and friendly, politely admitted that it was a great honor for her to meet Mr. Albert. The man took out his pipe and happily remarked that he was glad about Zilka's invention, because now, thanks to this device, he can brew coffee right at home. Blend himself was eager to learn how this magical instrument worked, and he later remarked that he did not want to delay it for a moment. Raj nodded approvingly. The girl carefully unwrapped the package containing the coffee grinder. While the girl was busy with her business, Bland called out to Mr. Lurin, wishing to have a word with him. Zil inclined his head slightly, held his breath, and adjusted himself to listen attentively to the noble gentleman. Bland noted that he had heard rumors about Zilko's habit of frequenting Rondel's coffee shop. Zilko confirmed with a smile that it was there that he liked to have breakfast and enjoy the aromatic coffee every morning. Zilka smiled and added that both the coffee and the food at this establishment were truly excellent. So when he didn't have new part-time jobs, he often came here. Blen said that he used to often visit Mr. Rondel, but recently his worries have increased, and he has almost no free time left. That is why the Zilka coffee grinders will be a real find for him. Zilka noted that his invention would hardly make coffee tastier than the one Mr. Rondel makes. However, he had certain safeguards. Duke Bland was presented with 2 coffee grinders. He immediately realized that each had its pros and cons. Zilk began to explain all the features in detail. In the end, the Duke realized that if he had to drink liters of coffee throughout the day, an automatic coffee grinder would be indispensable for him. He also noted that even Noid couldn't make coffee as delicious as Rondel's. Noid bowed to his master, assuring him not to worry. The butler declared that he intended to learn everything from him, and when, having equaled Rondel's skill, he could catch up with him, he would leave this world calmly, without regret. Bland only laughed and told Noid not to think up nonsense. He immediately added that sending the butler to an internship at a coffee shop was a great idea. This way, Rondel could learn the skills of real baristas and become an incomparable master of his craft. Zilk explained that being a bartender is a completely different profession, and true coffee masters are commonly called baristas. At that moment, the Duke listened attentively to every word of his guest, and as soon as he heard the expression by which experienced coffee masters were called, his eyes lit up. He thought it was incredibly stylish. The Duke, clenching his fist, admitted that he was impressed, and now dreams of having his own barista who would prepare coffee at the highest level right on his estate. Zilk smiled and suggested to Bland that they should set up specialized institutions to train specialists in this field. Hearing this, Albert Bland exclaimed happily that he fully shared Mr. Lauren's opinion. Zilka noted with a dry expression that they were currently looking at coffee grinders, and would discuss all other issues later. The Duke realized that he had been lost in a dream for a moment. A little embarrassed, he cleared his throat and sank into a chair. Blanc assured him that he could distinguish between the two tastes, but he wanted to taste and compare them for himself. Raj took out the rest of the prepared utensils, a teapot, cups and saucers, and a siphon. The girl smiled and noted that this was exactly what they had hoped for, so they had prepared everything they needed in advance. Afterwards, Rouge smiled broadly at Duke Bland and suggested that he make the coffee himself. These words stunned the aristocrat, leaving him speechless. Albert Bland gladly accepted the opportunity the boys had given him. He had to tell everything, so the Duke, pouring coffee beans into a handheld coffee grinder, set about grinding them energetically, not wasting a minute. Duke Bland showed considerable interest. After another spin, he glanced slowly at Noid, and confessed that every time he watched Rondel's skill, he wanted to make the drink himself. The butler was silent, only watching his master enjoy the moment. Albert Bland, though a grown man, now seemed defenseless, almost childlike. Once he mastered the manual coffee grinder, he took up the automatic one. He was surprised by its extraordinary convenience. All he had to do was press a button, and the job was done. The Duke glanced at the results and noted that everything went extremely quickly. Noid came up to him, scratched his chin thoughtfully, and added that this version was much faster than the manual method. Reg saw that the demonstration was going well, and she was quite pleased. Smiling, she gave a thumbs up to Zilka, who also seemed pleased with the result. When everything was ready and the coffee was ground, Reg, following Zilk's instructions, helped the Duke a little with the preparation. Then they all went together to the most interesting part, tasting both varieties of the drink. Taking his first sip, Albert Blaine raised his head and broke into a genuine smile. The man, who hadn't tasted coffee in a long time, noted that what they had prepared was surprisingly delicious. The Duke later added that, among other things, because he had made the drink himself, it seemed even more delicious to blend, as if his diligence could be felt in every sip. After trying out the automatic grinder, the Duke asked Noid how it was better than his own. The butler pretended not to have heard the question at all. Zilk knew full well that none of them would say a word about the Duke grinding the coffee completely wrong. After that, Blaine turned to the butler and said that he was considering buying both at once. This was how the man was going to master this technique on his own, and carefully weigh all the pros and cons of each magical artifact. In addition, from now on, he could enjoy aromatic coffee in his own home, and that was a real pleasure. Then the man stood up and announced to the whole room that the boys had done a great job. Rouge bowed to Mr. Bland with deep gratitude for such kind words. Zilk stood up and shook hands with the man, who was staring admiringly at the young genius. Then, Silt continued to share with Albert the intricacies of the process of creating this coffee equipment, and Albert carefully caught his every word. Meanwhile, Noid and Raj were up to their ears in paperwork and calculations. Noid called out to Zinc, drawing attention to a possible error in the documents regarding the stated price. Then Noid remarked that the price was too low for an instrument that Loren had created himself. The Duke was immediately intrigued and turned around, wanting to know more. The man called his butler and asked about the prices of these mysterious magical devices. Noid replied that a manual coffee grinder costs 80,000, and an automatic one costs as much as 1,300,000. Albert Bland was quite surprised by this news. He remarked to Zilka that this price was even lower than for an ordinary magic lamp. Afterwards, Albert wondered incredulously whether he had accidentally left out a few zeros in the documents. Zilka smiled broadly and explained that he was just trying to convey the aspirations of a person who dreams of developing a coffee culture in the capital. That is why he set a democratic price so that everyone can afford this drink. The news surprised Noid and Bland quite a bit. They froze, eyes wide, staring at Mr. Lauren, holding their breath in anticipation of what would happen next. Then the Duke laughed, and the butler bowed and declared that if the inventor insisted so much, they simply had no right to refuse him. The coffee was drunk to the last drop, and everyone was satisfied. Zilka and Raj returned to their lab. The girl was delighted with how everything turned out. They worked a little more, but Zilka suggested that they finish their work for the day and go home. Zilk threw on his raincoat and noted that his dedicated employees had been working diligently on the coffee grinders, even staying overtime. Now it was time to thank them. The guys had worked as hard as Zilk himself, so they could take a well-deserved break. Reg was beaming with happiness. Folding her hands in gratitude, the girl said with a joyful smile that this was wonderful, because she had been dreaming of having dinner with her family. Unlike his colleague, Tristan was not happy. He complained that he had too much free time, because he was lonely and had nothing to do. Zilka crossed his arms and said there was nothing he could do. Lauren defended single people, insisting that there was nothing wrong with that. Tristan, not missing the opportunity, asked the boss how he spent his free time. Raj, snorting merrily, had already managed to jump out the door, slamming it shut. Zilka smiled and remarked to Tristan, "An evening walk through the capital is a great opportunity to clear your mind and shake off the fatigue of the day." Zilk shared that in his free time he likes to go to coffee shops and bars. And when he stays at home, his creative spark awakens, and he starts cooking something delicious. Tristan asked if it makes you feel lonely to do this in private, without sharing your emotions with others. Zilk smiled and remarked that that was the whole point. Eventually, everyone dispersed, and Zilk took out the key and began to lock the laboratory door. After leaving his lab, Zilk hurried to the bustling city market, where a sea of people was bustling. On the way, he pondered what delicious food he would have for dinner that evening. Suddenly the man stopped near an aquarium, in which various fish and other inhabitants of the deep sea swam under bright lights. Suddenly Zilk thought, why not have seafood for dinner today? Then he was faced with a choice. How to prepare the fish. Grill the white fish with salt, enjoy it with teriyaki, or let his imagination run wild and cook a rich soup with various side dishes. After examining the goods in this department, the guy realized that he had no time to hurry, so he decided to take a leisurely walk through the market again to find the best products. Soon the boy noticed familiar faces among the crowd. It was Ida and Mariella, who were also leisurely looking at all sorts of stalls. Since these boys were adventurers, Zilk at first assumed they were simply trading in the loot they had taken from their hunt. It was obvious that the company was genuinely enjoying their company. Zilk kept his eyes on the couple and mentally noted that Vin was not at all like him. It seemed that the boy was not at all an inveterate recluse, unlike Zilk himself, in whom loneliness had taken root almost in his soul. Suddenly, Zilka's thoughts were interrupted by a loud voice from a megaphone. Someone in the crowd was persistently advertising dragon meat, inviting everyone to buy the fresh delicacy that had just been delivered to the place. Hearing this, Zilk instantly turned around and quickly rushed to the counter, holding the meat in his hands. Dragon meat was a refined delicacy that was almost never found in the city market. There was only one appetizing piece on the counter, resembling a neck. They were asking as much as 50,000 for 100 grams. Usually such delicacies were delivered directly to the homes of nobles. At that moment, Zil remembered how he had tasted this meat as a child. This was the dish that had been prepared for him on his birthday, served in the form of a juicy, almost raw steak. Zilk supposed that it must have been the meat from his own fingers. Its taste was so exceptional and unforgettable that it could not be compared to anything else. And to this day, that amazing pleasure has not left his thoughts. Zilka approached the merchant and asked about the meat. The young man wanted to know what part of the carcass it came from. The merchant replied that it was the tail, and began to praise this part, describing its advantages. The man noticed that the dragon's tail was constantly moving, so the meat turned out to be elastic, juicy, and surprisingly tasty. In response, Zilk raised his hand and asked, "Is it true that the taste of the tail surpasses even fingers?" The merchant smiled broadly and assured me that he knew a lot about dragon meat, having dealt with it many times at auctions and heard many good reviews. He added that finger meat couldn't even compare to the taste pleasure that a dragon's tail provides. Zilka pointed to the large portion and noted that the merchant had convinced him. The young man decided to buy a whole 600 grams of dragon meat. The people around him widened their eyes in surprise, not believing what they had heard. The merchant bowed to the aristocrat, sincerely thanking him for the purchase. For him, this transaction was extremely successful. Thanks to it, he became quite wealthy. The shopkeeper took a sharp knife and began to cut a piece of meat for Zilko. He assured the boy that he would be satisfied with his purchase. Then he asked if it was possible that one of the boy's relatives was not having a birthday. The man remarked that his wife or child would be happy to taste such a delicacy. Zilk smiled slightly in response and said that he did not have a family yet. The people around him whispered in surprise, watching the young man pay a lot of money for this piece. The merchant asked for whose celebration Silk was buying the meat, but the boy immediately denied it, saying that he was buying it exclusively for himself, so that he could enjoy the meal alone in his own company. Hearing these words, Zilk slowly lowered his hand. Everyone around him looked at him, some with sympathy, others clearly disapproving of such waste. The merchant also felt a certain awkwardness, and Zilk fidgeted, looking from one to the other, trying to figure out what was so inappropriate about what he had just said. The seller smiled and laughed heartily. The man said that Zilka should act on his own judgment, listening to his heart. Then he handed him the meat and thanked him again for the purchase. After visiting the market, Zilk, as he had promised, took a leisurely stroll through the streets, getting some fresh air, and then returned home. Climbing onto the porch, the boy opened the door and went inside. When he entered the hall, he was immediately noticed by Katarina. She was standing next to a bag filled to the brim with various purchases. As soon as Silt approached, the girl smiled sincerely and greeted him with great joy. Seeing the small package in his hand, Katarina assumed that he had probably gone shopping too. The girl replied that she had also been to the store. She shook the package slightly and added with a smile that she had managed to buy all this at a discount. Zilk glanced at his purchase and immediately thought, there was nothing to cook with such a set. After a short conversation, the boys slowly moved up the stairs. At that moment, Zilka felt a slight tension, as she remembered that their path lay along the same road. If they hadn't crossed paths earlier, Zilk would have simply passed by Katarina and gone home. He himself didn't quite understand how to treat her. A rather strange, even bizarre relationship had developed between them. Besides, the guy had recently received this artifact from her, the Sound Garden. He had no idea what she thought about such an exchange and how she reacted to it. Zilka also remembered the strange story that old Selba had once written. This story also troubled the boy. Something disturbing and unpleasant settled in his thoughts. Zilk didn't even listen to the whole thing, so he didn't learn many details. However, what he heard was enough for him to erase the recording from the artifact without hesitation. One day, looking at the girl, the bachelor thought that she must be an illegitimate child or something like that. Meanwhile, Katarina turned to Zilko with a question about the meat. She smiled and asked curiously what meat the aristocrat would choose for cooking today. Zilk calmly turned around and replied, "It would be a dragon." Katarina simply could not believe her ears. She opened her eyes wide and gripped the bag even tighter in her hands. Remembering that today was Zilk's birthday, she immediately asked about it. But upon hearing her words, Zilk's face instantly changed. The guy denied it. Then he added that even before she started acting, neither relatives nor friends celebrated birthdays today. He was already tired of such questions at the market. In that case, Katarina couldn't understand why Zilk had bought such expensive meat. However, he just smiled and explained he had just finished work and wanted to treat himself to something special. Katarina still couldn't get used to Zilko's extravagance. She looked at him in surprise, and this look made Zilko feel uncomfortable. As they walked further towards their apartments, Zilk remarked that it didn't matter who liked to eat what, since they lived in a free country. The girl completely agreed with that. Later, Zilka decided to inquire about the girl's career and how her concerts were going. He was interested in finding out how popular his songs, which she was now performing, had become. Katarina noted that thanks to Zilka, the new composition has become wildly popular, and now tickets are being sold out every day. Even he himself, if he wanted to get to the concert, would hardly be able to just get the coveted ticket. Zil clapped his hands softly and noted that there was a small problem here. Katarina smiled modestly, looking down, and admitted that there was no other way to put it. Almost to the door, the girl suddenly stopped and began searching for something in her purse. Finally, she handed the boy a small piece of paper. Katarina said that if Zilk wanted, he could take it. He carefully took the sheet of paper from her hands. The young man looked more closely and discovered that he was holding a front-row ticket to the same presentation he had just been talking about. Zilka felt embarrassed and started to lift his work suitcase. The bachelor sighed, noting that the ticket had cost him a tidy sum, so he would have to pay, whether he wanted to or not. Katarina stopped him, assuring him that there was no reason to worry. She had already gotten him a free ticket. The boy noted with surprise that now a girl's word really did carry weight in the theater. Zilka smiled and said that in that case she would gladly accept this gift and would definitely come. But suddenly Katarina pointed her finger at him and said that she also wanted something in return. They had already reached the door, and the girl winked at Zilka, hinting that she would need his help with the next composition. Zilk smiled in response and promised that he would certainly help. It was already dark outside. He took a luxurious piece of meat from the dragon's tail and carefully placed it on the table. Zilk rolled up his shirt sleeves with pleasure and smiled, thinking, tonight he would have a juicy steak for dinner. He had not tasted such a delicious dish in a long time. Then he took a sharp knife and began to cut the meat into neat steaks. Next, the pieces had to be carefully cleaned of films and excess fat. Before frying, the meat had to lie down and warm up to room temperature. While the meat was resting, Zilka began to gather various vegetables that he had stored at home and carefully arrange them on the table. It was time for the garnish, and he started with carrots. There were also asparagus and broccoli to accompany the meat. Next, Zilk picked up a pepper mill. The juicy steak needed a generous amount of seasoning on both sides, so he rubbed it thoroughly with freshly ground pepper. He used a mixture of 3 different types of pepper. When the meat was ready to fry, it was time to deal with the frying pan. The boy placed it on the stove and turned on the fire, gradually heating the vessel. His choice fell on a frying pan made of the steel of the Orc King, a luxury for which in the capital one had to pay as much as 20,000. When the pan was hot enough, Zilk grabbed a pair of tongs and took a piece of meat. Adding a little oil, he carefully placed the steak on the hot surface. The meat immediately sizzled appetizingly and juicily. The temperature was perfect. Zilk had begun perhaps the most crucial stage of cooking, because it was from this moment that the further frying process depended. He deftly flipped the steak, taking a short pause. The meat was perfect, and Zilk cooked it evenly on each side. After that, Zilk moved the piece of meat to another area of the pan. Now it was enough to take a few steps, and the already vacated place where the meat had just been fried could be used further. The pre-prepared vegetables were sent to the pan where the steak had previously been fried. They were supposed to be soaked in meat juices with the addition of butter and garlic to reveal the fullness of the flavor. Carefully stirring the vegetables with a steel spatula, Zilk began to check the meat. He poked it with the device, assessing its elasticity. It turned out that the meat was not yet ready. It needed to be browned a little. Finally, the meat was ready. It was carefully removed from the pan and left to rest so that the juices would distribute evenly inside the piece. The moment had come. The delicacy had been prepared. Dragon meat itself. Now it only remained to make sure that the merchant had not been mistaken when he assured them that the tail was much tastier than the fingers of this monster. To complete the perfect evening, all that was left was to choose a drink that would enhance the taste of this exquisite meat dish. Zilkin headed to his home bar and confidently picked up a couple of wine glasses. As he sifted through the bottles, the boy carefully searched for the red wine that would best complement the flavor of the juicy steak. As he was sorting through the bottles, Zilk suddenly turned pale. All the red wine was gone. He hadn't expected this, and he didn't feel like going outside anymore, because the food was slowly losing its heat. Zilka remembered that he had come home from work yesterday and had finished the last of his red wine, deciding to relax a bit. The drink was truly delicious, and that evening Zilka enjoyed it with homemade cheese. After Zilk had looked around the shelves some more, he returned to his dinner and thought about it. He didn't seem to feel like buying anything new at all, so the selection left much to be desired. He needed to go back to the shelves and find something else. Taking another look at his home bar collection, Zilka wondered, what else would suit him today? What drink would best complement the flavor of the meat? Soon his eyes fell on a bottle among the wine shelves. It wasn't the most exquisite wine, of course, but it would probably be fine. But the meat was still the most important thing to him. Turning around, he noticed a surprisingly beautiful glass on his table. With this discovery, a smile appeared on Zilko's face. Now he did not hesitate. because he had not bought this thing in vain. Turning around, Zilka immediately came across what he was looking for. The aristocrat decided to treat himself to some exquisite champagne from the neighboring capital. This pleasure could brighten up his evening. Zilk opened the bottle and poured himself half a glass of the drink. After setting out the cutlery and waiting for everything to be ready for the meal, he carefully sat down on the chair, folded his arms, and wished himself a delicious meal. After that, he carefully sipped his drink and stuck a piece of meat in with his fork. Zilka instantly bit into the piece and was genuinely impressed by its taste. Zilk's eyes widened in delight. He could hardly believe how delicious it was. The merchant was indeed not deceived. The meat from the tail turned out to be much more tender and tasty. Because the tail is always in motion, the meat from this part was surprisingly juicy and almost completely fat-free. It is safe to say that this is one of the most active muscle areas of the dragon. Taking another sip, Zilk stared intently at the sparkling bubbles playing in his glass and licked his lips. The champagne was also excellent. It perfectly highlighted the taste of the meat. Next, of course, it was time to taste the vegetables. They also had to remain tender and not overcooked. Zilk was sure neither he nor anyone he knew was celebrating a birthday today. But do you really need a special reason to treat yourself to a wonderful and exquisite dinner that you put your whole soul into? Continuing to enjoy the moment, Zilk reflected. If you crave deliciousness, it will certainly appear in your life, as it had happened before. The dinner was truly unsurpassed. Raising his glass a second time, Zilk said with the confidence of an aristocrat that this was his life principle as a lonely nobleman. A feeling of relief instantly enveloped him. It seemed that all his fatigue had melted away without a trace. After a hearty dinner, Zilka quickly gathered everything he needed and set off to work. His mood was simply excellent, so he could use his inspiration to the fullest. When he arrived, Raj and Tristan were still engrossed in their work. The man greeted them and headed for his office. Raj opened the door shortly after. The girl never went inside, but, holding the door, announced that a guest had come to Zilka's house. She also clarified that it was one of Zilka's relatives. Zilk couldn't believe it. At such moments, he couldn't even imagine who would dare to bother him, and for what reason. They had not had any contact with their family for a long time. He instantly remembered his sister, who always made fun of him. Zilk decided that they were again planning to invite him to a family dinner, which he did not want at all. Opening the door, Zilk saw a young man with blonde hair and glasses in front of him, who instantly smiled warmly and waved happily at him. For the inventor, this was an event that struck him as a double surprise. Regito froze in place, shocked to the core of her soul. Her eyes widened in surprise. Zilk's face clearly showed displeasure at the unexpected guest, but he, as if nothing had happened, continued to smile amiably and wave his hand energetically. After that, Zil silently watched the boy hiding behind the door for some time, and then quietly said that this was not his family at all. After that, the guy slammed the door and ordered the guests to go back. However, the boy resolutely opened the door, trying to block Zilka's path. The blonde-haired youth exclaimed that it was too cruel to do that to his younger brother. Zilk walked on, adjusting his tie, when suddenly he heard the voice of a young man behind him, who, sticking out his tongue, called out to him, "Brother!" This address instantly threw the inventor off balance. Zilk turned around sharply, angrily ordered the boy to be quiet, and then threatened to kill him if he spoke to him like that again. These words obviously amused the blonde considerably. Zilka's younger brother was surprised by her strange behavior, because it was he who introduced her to Ilya, although at the same time he began to feel hostility towards the guy. At the time, Zilk thought the idea was brilliant, but later admitted that he actually only regretted his action. Suddenly, something caught their attention. Tristan was the first to lose his temper. He shouted indignantly, pointing his finger at Zilko. The guy had no idea that Zilko would introduce someone to Ilya. His irritation was clearly visible. Then Tristan began to loudly complain that Zil would never introduce him to anyone. The boy asked him to find someone for him, preferably from aristocratic circles. At that moment, Zilk remembered Tristan's words. He began to think about which girl from aristocratic circles he could introduce to him. Katarina immediately came to mind. But within a moment, Zilka rejected the idea and told Tristan that he couldn't help. He didn't have any girls he could introduce to the employee. Raj and Zilka's younger brother stood silently on the sidelines, watching their conversation. Tristan loudly expressed surprise, directing his gaze at Zilka, at the fact that the boy had no friends or attractive girls around him. Zilka insisted that it wasn't about looks, but Tristan strongly disagreed. He argued that with Zilka's credentials and status, he could easily be courting 2 or even 3 girls at the same time. The younger brother thought about it, because from the outside, Zilk seems like a really attractive, wealthy, and intelligent guy. However, it was worth looking deeper into his inner world. Many girls sincerely dreamed of getting to know him better. Zilka admitted that he values solitude, and that the presence of women only prevents him from enjoying a quiet life. Tristan felt that this was unfair and began to beg Ludwig to introduce him to someone. However, Zilka's younger brother pointed out that he was already married, and therefore did not maintain relationships with other girls. Later, Zilk noticed that Ludwig also had some pretty girls working in his workshop. Tristan immediately pounced on him again, not giving up hope. Ludwig noticed that all the girls who worked for him had been married for a long time. Novenka had only recently become a wife. Zilka thought it was too early, because they were still very young. Ludwig reached out, placed his hands on the back of his head, and noticed that all these girls were proficient in alchemy, so they were making a lot of money. There were always plenty of people interested in such craftsmen. Zilk came to the conclusion that in this world, everything is decided by money and appearance. Nothing changes. Meanwhile, Tristan did not give up trying to persuade others, and now rushed to Raj with a request. The girl smiled broadly, waved her arms energetically, and exclaimed happily that she was surrounded by mothers with babies. She sincerely apologized to Tristan, but he still wouldn't calm down and continued to scream. While Tristan, on his knees, begged Raj to remember at least one of his many girlfriends. Zilk turned to Ludwig and asked what had brought him here. At first, Zilk thought that Ludwig had come instead of Ilya, to drag him out to the family dinner again. However, the latter only smiled, raised his hands, and assured him that today he had come for a completely different reason. Ludwig smiled broadly and winked at his brother. The guy suggested that Zilka stop by one of the local bars after work to freshen up a bit. Zelka was much more pleased with this than even the invitation to dinner. He laughed merrily when he noticed that Ludwig had given his family a fabricated excuse for his absence, that he was going to visit his brother, and he himself was going to go to the bars and have a drink or two. Ludwig made a sarcastic joke, calling his brother a real detective. After that, he hugged him and asked Zilko to take him to a decent establishment and show him around. Did it finally seem like he agreed to take his brother to that bar he had been thinking about? He abruptly pushed his hand away and informed him that he still had to get ready. Zilk was almost done with his work and assured him that he would be able to spend some time with Ludwig afterwards. And Rouge was still soothing the disgruntled Tristan, who kept whining. After finishing work, both brothers went for a walk through the night city. The hero admitted that it had been a long time since he had walked like this without any purpose in the middle of the darkness. Zilk wondered if he had ever gone out for dinner so late. Ludwig replied that Ilya was asking him to come home earlier. Zilka noted that this was not cool at all, because now he couldn't just go out for a drink with his friends in the evening. Ludwig thought back to his youth, when he and Zilko had often seen each other. He sighed, remembering those carefree times when he could invite his friend for a drink at the first whim. Zilk raised his head slightly, peering into the night sky, and noted with a smile that under such circumstances he was even more happy about his freedom. He was not married and no one restricted his actions. They will say that when you are alone, no circumstances can hold you back. If you want to drink, you just go and do it, and no one will forbid you to indulge in it at least every day. Despite all the difficulties, Ludwig did not lose his cheerful spirit. He turned around, smiled broadly, and confidently declared, "In marriage there are also many bright moments and reasons for joy." He cited the moments spent with Ilya, as well as the precious moments he spent with his beloved daughter. All of this, without a doubt, had real value. They continued walking, and Zilk gave his brother a narrowed look, asking why he had run away then. Ludwig just laughed. "It was simple," he said. "Sometimes you just need to give yourself a break." After that, Zilk provoked Ludwig into admitting that there were things in marriage that he was incapable of. Ludwig exclaimed that it was all true, but he felt no pity at all. Zilk kept his cool and calmly asked his brother not to make a fuss. They chose the right passage and went down the stairs to the Ice Rock Bar. Ludwig was struck by this inconspicuous, almost hidden from prying eyes, place with a strange name. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the welcome bell above the door rang loudly, alerting the staff of the arrival of visitors. Soon, a girl bartender appeared from the hall, the same one who always works here. Zilk smiled at her with admiration and greeted her happily, immediately taking a seat at the bar. It was a real joy for him to return here. Ludwig was admiring the incredible interior of the bar, until he suddenly noticed that there was not a soul in the room. This made him feel a little uncomfortable. Then Silke pushed her brother, ordering him to sit down. Meanwhile, the girl behind the counter handed them wet towels and a glass of ice water. Ludwig was delighted that Silke knew such incredible places. The fact that there was no one here again seemed strange, but at the same time, it was completely in line with Silke's nature. The young man smiled broadly and sincerely thanked the girl who handed him the wet towel. With imperturbable dignity, Silke began to carefully wipe his hands, remaining calm. The aristocrat dealt with this gracefully, but suddenly noticed his lover imperceptibly backing away from the girl, just as she turned to pick up the dishes. Ludwig carelessly waved his hand and hit his brother on the shoulder, which caused Silke's obvious displeasure. Ludwig wondered why his brother hadn't told him about this amazing place before. Silke, unconsciously massaging his shoulder, was about to answer first, but in the end he just waved it off, saying that he had come here to have a glass after a tiring day at work. Smiling, he advised Ludwig to appreciate the local drinks, because the guys had some truly rare delicacies in stock. Ludwig raised his cocktail glass and touched the straw with his lips. As soon as he tasted the drink, he immediately exclaimed indignantly. The guy enthusiastically remarked that it was an incredibly delicious and refreshing cocktail. He had never tasted anything like it before. Silke smiled mysteriously and added that he knew a lot about such things. At that moment, the girl began to prepare a new batch of drinks for her guests. Ludwig noticed with admiration that she was practicing magic flawlessly. The spectacle was truly captivating. The girl, without taking her gaze off the table, thanked him for the compliment. After that, Ludwig introduced himself and politely asked her name. Silke immediately clarified that he didn't know the girl's name either. Ludwig gaped and exclaimed that the guy had dragged him here, and he didn't even know the bartender's name. The girl smiled modestly and introduced herself to Lisa. She confessed that she was sincerely glad to finally meet her guests. Zil, meanwhile, did not take his thoughtful gaze from her. At that moment, Ludwig burst into a sincere smile and began to praise the young woman, enthusiastically noting her beautiful name. However, Zil clearly did not like it. Alessi turned to Zilko and asked what his name was. The boy hesitated a little, then introduced himself as Zilka Lauren. Hearing this, the girl stared at him with incredible astonishment. The girl looked at the boy with curiosity and asked if he was really the same inventor of magical devices who created the refrigerator. Zilk confirmed that he was. And, thinking about it, he suddenly realized that this was the first time he had noticed any emotion on her face. She smiled and said that then she should thank Zilka. He just smiled back and said that there was no point in thanking her. After all, he had invented the refrigerator primarily for his own convenience. A tense silence fell in the bar. The girl looked at the boys carefully and noticed that they didn't look like real brothers at all. Yes, they had the same last name, but that was where all their similarities ended. Zilka nodded towards Ludwig, gave him a proud thumbs up, and declared that this was his sister's husband. He would have thought it funny if he and Ludwig had looked even slightly alike, but fortunately for him, there was not the slightest resemblance between them. The girl, hearing this, noted with a smile that now everything fell into place for her. At that moment, Ludwig exclaimed that Zilk was constantly insulting him. The girl did not expect such a reaction. She was confused and a little scared. Ludwig continued his story and admitted that he was the eldest son in the family. But the idea of marriage did not appeal to him at all. It was as if he was involuntarily shifting all the worries and expectations onto the shoulders of his younger brothers and sisters. Zilk noticed that this was quite strange, because the girl is usually not very talkative and rarely reveals her feelings. But at the same time she is extremely easy to talk to visitors. At that moment, the door opened again, and a loud chime rang out. A light gust of wind blew into the bar, forcing the guys to turn around and look with curiosity at the new visitor. Suddenly, Zilk heard someone addressing him, claiming to recognize the guy. Meanwhile, this voice did not seem alien to Zilk either. It had a familiar intonation, so he involuntarily began to turn towards the entrance. It was IT, holding his backpack and sword in his hands. It looked like the boy had just returned to the capital from another trip in search of goods for the city's merchants. It quickly approached Zilk and greeted him cheerfully. He admitted that he had not expected to meet him in such a place. In response, Zilk only sighed and noted that he would not return here again. Ludwig moved forward a little, making room, and then leaned over to Zilko. The latter, not believing his own eyes, only said in surprise that Ludwig apparently had acquaintances. 8 immediately intervened in the conversation. He pointed at himself encouragingly with his thumb and announced that his name was 8, and he was a friend of Zilka. At these words, Zilka glanced at the boy and coldly denied that there could be no question of friendship between them. Ida was a little offended and grabbed Zilks by the hair, mocking him. The guy stretched out his hand towards her and added that they had been drinking coffee together, and therefore their souls were now connected. Zilk took a glass of water and remarked that in that case he would rather remain an acquaintance than a friend. Yit only smiled in response, saying that Zilk, as always, was reserved and indifferent in his relations with others. Zilk got angry, saying that it was completely different. Eat was being too nice to him, but in reality, he just didn't mind eating other people's food. To this, Eat just shrugged his shoulders, saying that he had no use for it, because everything was so delicious that it was impossible to resist. When their conversation was over and they returned to the counter, Zilla's cheerful laughter could be heard somewhere nearby. Ludwig glanced at him in surprise. He stared at Zilla with a silent question in his eyes, because, despite all his assurances, it seemed that Zilla had found friends. Zilka jumped up abruptly, grabbed Ludwig by the tie, and exclaimed that his own brother considered him a complete loser, who didn't even have a single friend. Zilk released Ludwig and returned to his seat. Then the boy crossed his arms over his chest and turned to Toit, wondering why he had come today without Mario. Eighth looked at him in surprise, and Zilka quickly explained that he had seen them together the day before at the Central Market when he was buying meat for dinner. Eighth was a little embarrassed. The boy later suggested that Zilk must have mistaken Meryl for his girlfriend, as his questions had implied. Eight quickly dispelled this misconception, explaining that Meryl was actually just a teammate. A glass of gin and tonic for Edis was already ready, and Alyssa placed it on the bar in front of the boy. Ledwig smiled and joked that Edis had been seen with that girl from the shop a lot lately. Edis laughed back and confirmed that this was indeed the case. Zilka noticed that the boy seemed much calmer today than he had been last time at the lake. He turned to the inventor and asked what the boy had been talking about with Meryl. In response, Zilka asked a counter-question. What could he have said to Meryl that made Eight want to discuss it himself? With a slight movement, Eight raised his head, scratched his chin, and noticed that the girl's behavior had noticeably changed since then. He was convinced that Zilka was the reason for this. He admitted that he felt much more at ease with her than with other girls. Meryl relaxed and behaved in a way that unexpectedly changed her from the inside out. Zilk smiled and raised the glass to his lips, preparing to drink. However, before taking a sip, he remarked that it would be wonderful if everything really turned out that way. It stood up resolutely and loudly warned Zilk not to try to mislead him. At this, Ludwig intervened in the conversation, noting that Zilk had brainwashed someone again, this time a girl. Zilk, however, remained completely calm, and assured her that he had only recommended that she stay away from unmarried men that day. Zoke smiled even wider and praised Meryl, calling her smart for taking his advice and putting her plan into action. As time showed, everything worked out wonderfully. Eight smiled broadly in response and scratched the back of his head shyly. He sincerely thanked Zilka for everything he had done for him. It seemed that the inventor really had a talent for women, if he had managed to help so much. Ludwig still couldn't recover. Pushed aside his emotions, straightened his glasses, and exclaimed that it seemed like they were already eager to get married. After all, he himself had once experienced something similar. After Ludwig's words, it raised a glass of gin and tonic, saying the name Marie at length. And then added that, after all, the name wasn't so bad. At that moment, everyone turned their gazes in surprise at Zilko, who, choking on his cocktail, began to clear his throat. What he heard stunned him so much that he could hardly believe his own ears. Having put down his glass, he looked thoughtfully at his food and realized that after living so many years in solitude, he was now talking nonsense. Then he said quietly that things were bad because his new friend had strayed from the true path. Zilk turned to Lesse with a nervous look. Reaching out his hand to her, he noticed that Ida seemed to be complaining of a headache from the drink. The guy asked for something soothing. LSE turned away, leaving everything as it was. Ez sat there with a slight smile, apparently quite content with life. And only then did Zilt realize that of all the people in the bar, he was the one who had never really figured this guy out. It had been several months since the boys had last met for a drink at the bar. Time had passed without them noticing, and the weather outside was still fabulous. As usual, Zilk was absorbed in developing new magical artifacts at work. Suddenly there was a knock on the door, and Rouge loudly ordered the visitor to enter. Zilk looked up and noticed an unexpected visitor in his workshop. It was Eaton. Zilk couldn't figure out what had brought this guy to work for him. It did not appear alone. Next to him on the threshold was Mariel, who was smiling shyly from behind the boy's back. It greeted Raj happily, emphasizing that it had been a long time since he had seen him. Raj, opening the door for the boys, smiled and asked why they had come to their workshop. Eitz paused for a moment, then turned his gaze to Zilko. Then he remarked that he would be very glad to have a word with Zilko, if the dry-faced gentleman would allow a little conversation. Raj opened the door wider hospitably, and one by one the boys began to enter. Roj was incredibly surprised that he had dared to try new silk. At that moment, Tristan, who was working at the machine, also turned around in confusion and stared at his boss. The workshop workers found this situation suspicious. Raj couldn't understand why it was looking for Zilka so persistently, and Tristan concluded that the boss must have his friends. Although you won't hear anything from these guys except rudeness, Zilka mused. After that, he immersed himself in his papers again, and ordered Raj to inform everyone that he was not at the place today. It immediately exclaimed that Zilka was sitting right in front of him, shamelessly pretending that he wasn't there. Rouge and Tristan, without losing their vigilance, continued to cast suspicious glances at their boss. Rouge quipped that if this continued, Zilk might even stop joking, since 8 was one of the key suppliers of goods for his store. Then Zilk sighed heavily, admitting that there was nothing he could do about it. Standing up, he said that they would have a few words in the living room, and then he began to see the boys off. Zilk made coffee for everyone, set the table, and settled himself comfortably in a chair. He turned to his guests, asking what had brought them to him, and it turned out that both of them intended to talk to him about something important. At that moment, as soon as Zilk turned to them, Ethan and Marielle almost imperceptibly looked at each other, and, smiling, immediately began to nod at each other. After that, they turned to Zilko, and each confidently announced that they had decided to get married. This did not come as a surprise to Zilko. He had realized at the bar that he had lost his soulmate. Then Zilka looked down, a shadow of sadness in his eyes. He said that he congratulated the boys on their achievements. Meryl again could not contain her indignation at the boys' indifference. Zilka smiled and said that he had already foreseen this development, having seen the couple at the market. It blushed and, a little embarrassed, began to scratch the back of its head, and Marielle became even more embarrassed. Zilk crossed his arms over his chest and noted that the boys had made this decision very quickly, congratulating them again on it. Meanwhile, Yates began to explain in more detail. The guy noted that they were essentially brothers in arms like the Zilknos. At the same time, their bond was much deeper than that of ordinary couples, and this is precisely what can explain the speed of the decision made. Zilk turned to Meryl and noticed that she did not know how to approach 8. The girl exploded. She said that this was not the time and place for such conversations. After all, the guys were not just acquaintances. They overcome dangerous adventures together, perform difficult work side by side. There was even a closer bond between them than between ordinary couples in love. 8 instantly turned his smile into a serious expression, and informed Zilt that they had come here to invite the guy to the wedding. At that moment, Zilt closed his eyes and firmly declared his refusal. Ida did not hide his surprise. He still considered Zilk his friend, and Mario in the meantime persistently demanded explanations from him. Zilk only shrugged, sincerely not understanding why the boys were interested in him at all. Zielka was convinced that we were completely different. After all, he always had a lot of friends around him. However, despite this, he did not have any real friends who would invite him to such an event. For example, Meryl, one of them, had only turned to Zielka for advice once, and he had never considered them close. In fact, they were just acquaintances. It confidently assumed that perhaps Zilk had decided that the boys weren't that close to each other. True Ify was not convinced by these words. Zook pondered them, considering what he had heard. It said that among men of that age, few were still single. He and Zilka were very similar, and this gave him a special feeling of kinship with him. After that, it confidently stated that there was nothing unusual in his desire to see his soulmate at the wedding. These words confused everything in Zilka's head. Her thoughts instantly whirled around in a whirlwind. In this world, marriage was of utmost importance, as it was believed that the greatest happiness was to create a strong family. People valued not only ordinary things, such as silk or food, but also anything that stood out from the ordinary. Of course, it was not easy for society, friends, or relatives to understand people like Zilk and Yit. Because of this, establishing contact with them became a real problem. That's why, when they met such a loner, they felt a certain kinship with each other. If you think about it, there was nothing strange in this. Zilk thought about this proposal seriously. Its arguments were convincing and gave him reason to think. At this moment, it carefully watched his friend, hoping to see agreement in his eyes. The pause dragged on, and finally, 8 decided to break it himself. He persistently continued to persuade Zilko to make a choice, and then, looking into the inventor's eyes, the boy asked if he really didn't want to go anywhere else. Zilko replied that he needed to think about it, as he was used to enjoying a free, single life. Therefore, it was difficult for him to agree to go to the wedding. Such an idea was completely against his character. After that, he added that it was completely inappropriate for him to appear at that person's wedding. In response, Mariel couldn't help but laugh, covering her mouth with her hand. Smiling, the girl looked at Zilko and said that he turned out to be much more serious than she had initially thought. At first, she'd imagined him to be completely different. Zilka asked the girl what she meant by saying those words. Muriel only laughed harder in response and remarked that a normal person would not even think about such nonsense. Moreover, she liked it. Zilka's sincerity impressed her, because he always spoke openly about everything, constantly defending his beliefs and personal boundaries. After that, IIT got up from the couch, and Meryl followed him. The guy turned to Zilkin once more, gave her a smile, as if wanting to say something after all. Ive said that no matter what Zilk thought, he still wanted to see him at this guy's wedding. So the invitation stood. The envelope, sealed with wax, was left on the table. The door slammed shut, and Zilka was left alone in his room. His gaze focused on the bundle lying before him. He heard the boys say goodbye to Raj and Tristan and then go outside. The man bowed his head heavily, lost in thought about his next move. Returning to the workshop, Zilk noticed his workers in high spirits. They were enthusiastically discussing something important. For a moment, his attention was caught by an envelope that one of the girls was holding. Zilk began to descend, and trying to figure out if this also meant an invitation to eat, looked around questioningly. Reg took the envelope in her hands and noted that they were cooperating, so if she was called, she would definitely come. Reg asked her boss if Zilk was planning to attend the guy's wedding, but the inventor replied that he couldn't say for sure yet. There were many reasons why he hadn't decided yet. Zilk sat down in his chair, carefully placing the envelope in front of him. Raj came closer, resting her hands on her hips. The girl noted with a smile that nothing strange had happened. Zilk, as usual, was blowing the problem out of thin air. Zilka asked in surprise what these words meant, and the girl explained. They invited Zilka first. They did it sincerely and from a pure heart. From all this, Zolt could simply show up, say a few warm congratulations to the newlyweds, and that would be all. Nothing complicated, a simple formality, which, however, would bring the guests a lot of pleasant impressions. Rouge noted that Zilt could bring happiness to 2 people because of this. And Tristan added that even if Zilt felt awkward, the main thing was that the guys were happy together. Zook crossed his arms over his chest and noted that maybe Rag and Tristan were right. After all, the main characters of this wedding story would be 8 and Mariella, so all of this had only an indirect connection to the bachelor. This holiday was entirely dedicated to the boys, and their emotions should be the focus. So he should be there for them, to bring joy to the boys, not for his own pleasure. However, anxiety crept into the protagonist's soul. Thoughts that this was wrong haunted Zilka. It seemed to him that such an act would contradict his own beliefs, and that those around him would begin to look at him differently. Zilka really wanted to congratulate the boys and understood that it was really necessary to do so. Yit would probably be happy with such a gesture. However, it remained a mystery how he would behave further, because he was already showing extraordinary emotions towards Zilka. All this time, the aristocrat had a feeling that he did not belong here. As soon as he heard the first words about marriage, doubts settled in his heart, which did not give him peace even for a moment. Zilk's spirits were growing lower and lower. It seemed as if cats were scratching at his soul inside him. He crossed his arms over his chest and pondered this difficult choice. After that, Zilk looked at the table. It immediately occurred to him that he had forgotten to tell the boys about the coffee grinders that were already waiting for them. Silt carefully wrapped his gift and began to pack. Raj and Tristan were still busy with their own business, and Zilka was so absorbed in his thoughts about the upcoming wedding that he decided to go home to be alone and to be in the silence of his own thoughts. Returning home, Zilka opened the door to the lobby and looking down, slowly walked on. Suddenly he heard a surprised exclamation, and was surprised to see Katarina standing in the corridor. The girl smiled broadly and noted that Zilka had come at the perfect moment. She shared her desire to record her next song as soon as possible, so she suggested that Zilka take a walk with her for a while. It was quite clear that Zilk was not in the mood for work, so the guy immediately turned to the girl and asked if it would be better to postpone creating music for another time. However, Katarina reminded him that he had promised to support her. Zilka assured him that he remembered everything perfectly, but if he didn't feel like it right now, was it really such a problem? Then he agreed, adding that he had to bring his things first, and then they would meet at the coffee shop. The girl arranged the bag comfortably on her shoulder and announced with a joyful smile that in that case they had an agreement. She didn't even take her things home, so soon Zilk was already approaching the meeting place. The girl sat down by the window and had already ordered a drink for herself. She sat slowly savoring her coffee, trying to understand all its subtle nuances. But the drink still seemed too bitter to her. Katarina couldn't find a place to rest from her excitement, so, looking around, she quickly poured sugar into a cup and began to stir vigorously in order to somehow calm the tense atmosphere. It's quite strange. She ordered a coffee, probably trying to impress Zilko. But suddenly her gaze fell on the man who was watching her intently through the window of the coffee shop. Zook entered the room and took off his outerwear. He was about to sit down at the table when Katarina remarked that it was not at all dignified to spy on a girl from the street. Zilka smiled, looked at her, and said that this was only possible if he didn't want her to see him. The girl pressed a button and announced that they were ready to get down to business. Zilk looked tired, but he didn't lose his composure. He turned to the girl and asked her what song she would like to listen to and understand this time. Smiling, Katarina added with a warm note in her voice that she was open to different options. After that, the girl confessed that she liked love songs the most. Zook looked at her carefully and calmly said that he was already prepared. Later, the boy began to hum a melody quietly. Katarina, sitting comfortably and resting her head on her hand, listened with rapture to his singing. She liked the melody, and the girl was completely lost in her own thoughts. She held the pen, but she was not at all focused on the common cause for which they had come here. Sielka's tone gradually changed, conveying his mood more and more clearly. Katarina sensed something was wrong, and looked in surprise at Sielka, who, meanwhile, did not stop and continued talking. Seeing the girl looking at him in confusion, the aristocrat immediately tried to find out what had caused her mood. At that moment, she stopped Zilko. She pointed her pen at the boy and noticed that Zilk was acting strangely today. She didn't notice it right away, but she had to give it her all. Katarina usually noticed that Zilk sang with pleasure, and his songs were always filled with warmth. But today, the young man seemed to be floating in the clouds, and even the rhythm became unusually off.